Chapter 753. During the cultivation process of Luo Fan's clone, he felt that time had passed by slowly. The mysteriousness of the passageway completely separated the space-time changes in the passageway from his perception of time. Although he felt that a long time had passed, the passageway did not seem any different from when he first entered it. First text, it was as if his body had not moved at all. It was as if the feeling of him breaking through layers of space-time and advancing an extremely long distance during that long period of time had become an illusion. In a trance, in Luo Fan's clone's perception, 360,000 years had passed. On this day, the endless energy around Luo Fan's clone suddenly paused and suddenly dissipated without a sound. Even the energy waves, which were 10 times stronger than when nothing had passed through the passageway, had disappeared without a trace. It was as if nothing from the outside world existed in the passageway. As the energy subsided, Luo Fan's clone, who had been wrapped in energy for 360,000 years, was revealed. It was a strange body. The head of this body was a size larger than that of an innate Taoism body. Its arms were several times longer than that of an innate Taoism body, and its body was slightly smaller than that of an innate Taoism body. When all these changes were combined together, the body seemed to have turned into a big-headed gorilla. It was similar to the human sovereign. Although his appearance still belonged to Luo Fan, he could already be seen as a creature of the great heaven origin world. This body was naturally the body that Luo Fan had formed after cultivating the two cultivation method. Not only did this body look completely different from his original body on the surface, but it was also completely different from his original body on the inside. Luo Fan sensed his body slightly, and an inexplicable smile appeared on his face. Although this body was intrinsically different from the innate Taoism physique, it was also perfect and flawless. It also contained some kind of inconceivable profundity and conformed to some kind of supreme principle. It was no weaker than the innate Taoism physique when it came to cultivation. In fact, it was even better in some aspects. This should be the body form of the existence that created the great Tianyuan world. This thought flashed across Luo Fan's mind. This body was naturally formed after he completely replaced the mysterious characteristics that he had brought from the primordial world with the mysterious characteristics of the Tianyuan world. It was a form that was suitable for cultivation. The determination of this form was similar to how Luo Fan had determined that the innate Taoism body was suitable for cultivation in the primordial world. It was the cultivation body of the great Tianyuan world, or rather, the innate Taoism body of the great Tianyuan world. The appearance of a body suitable for cultivation was naturally decided by the creator of the world. The reason why the primordial world had the appearance of the innate Taoism body suitable for cultivation was because Pangu, who had created the primordial world, had the appearance of the innate Taoism body. From this, it could be deduced that the appearance of Luo Fan's clone in the great Tianyuan world was suitable for cultivation because the existence that created the world had such an appearance. However, at Luo Fan's current realm, the appearance of his body could no longer shackle his heart. Not to mention that the proportions of his body had become different from the past. Even if his entire body was flipped over and turned into the appearance of an ant, as long as it was still suitable for cultivation, Luo Fan would not care in the slightest. He would not feel that there was anything wrong with this. He would not care about the brightness and twists of the future road, and maintain the appearance of his familiar body. Therefore, after lamenting about the origin of this body, he put it aside. With that thought, he realized that the two cultivation techniques in his body had an inexplicable connection with the past and the future. However, it was extremely blurry, and he could not break through the restrictions of the past and the future. He knew that he was still a step away from letting these two cultivation techniques truly break through time and space and transcend the past and the future. He could only sigh to himself. However, this sigh did not make him too depressed. After all, he had completed his initial goal. At this moment, not only his will, but the essence of his soul had also completely assimilated with the great Tianyuan world. In the future, when he entered the great Tianyuan world, it would be like a drop of water entering the ocean. He would no longer be out of place. As long as he was careful, it would not be easy for the saints to discover that he was a guest from another world. As for this body, it was extremely mysterious. Not only did it possess the characteristics that were suitable for cultivation in the great Tianyuan world, it also contained the endless laws, and even the elusive great Tao within the tunnel. It was completely self-contained, like a small independent world. It constantly blended with all the laws, and great Tao in the surrounding tunnel. Its movements were like the natural flow of the laws, and great Tao. There was not a single trace of disharmony. It was precisely because of this characteristic that even though this body was countless times stronger than the avatar condensed from his will 360,000 years ago, it did not cause any reaction from the energy in the passageway. Instead, it was like a void without substance, and no matter how the boundless energy surged through it, it would naturally not cause any special energy fluctuations. Aside from that, he had completely comprehended the essence of the two cultivation techniques that he had found to be extremely complicated and profound 360,000 years ago. In fact, he had even completely engraved those two cultivation techniques into his own life essence. This achievement was quite shocking, and it had even reached an inconceivable level. If he had to describe it, it would be that if he completely erased all of his memories regarding the two cultivation techniques, even if he completely erased all of his memories related to the two cultivation techniques, he would still be able to recreate the two cultivation techniques with a single thought. In fact, the cultivation techniques that he created might even be more profound and simplified. At this level, Luo Fan no longer had any doubts regarding the two cultivation technique. With a thought, he knew that this was the time to pass the two cultivation techniques to his main body, so that his past could borrow the two cultivation techniques to cultivate them. As a result, an extremely mysterious connection that even transcended space-time was established between his clone and his main body. After a little inquiry, he knew that he was connected to his main body before he had obtained the two cultivation technique. Without any hesitation, he directly passed the two cultivation techniques over. Luo Fan's main body was naturally inexplicably surprised, but his Taoist heart was, after all, so firm that it was almost eternally unmoving. Therefore, he did not have much reaction, nor did he have much communication with his clone at this time. After obtaining the two cultivation techniques, he directly cut off the connection between them. After the connection between his main body and his clone was completely cut off, Luo Fan's clone finally felt a sense of relief. Although he had obtained these two cultivation techniques in the past, he would definitely pass them back before he left this passage. But after all, this was a strange process of reversing the cause and effect. Even if his Taoist heart was firm and his soul was complete, before he could completely make up for this cause and effect, he would still be under a lot of pressure. Therefore, at this time, when he had finally made up for this cause and effect, he seemed to be a lot more relaxed. After relaxing for a while, he stirred the power that was born in his body. It was completely different from the power he had in the past, but it had already reached the peak of the disbanded celestial of the great all-embracing heaven. The speed of his body moving forward increased dramatically. Because his body and power had been completely integrated with the countless strange spacetime inside this passage, he indeed seemed to be many times more relaxed in this passage than in the past. The layers of spacetime that originally required a lot of effort to break through seemed to not exist at this moment, allowing him to pass through at will without the slightest resistance. Therefore, in this passage, for the first time, he felt that he was moving forward. He felt that the distance to the other exit of the passage was shortening. More than 400,000 years of time was really not wasted. The mind of Luo Fan's clone couldn't help but have such a thought. But it was just a thought. After that, he put more effort into comprehending the two cultivation technique. He worked hard to absorb the energy from the outside world, refining his body, his spirit, and his mind. He worked hard to improve the purity of his body, spirit, and mind, and worked hard to deepen their integration with the energy of the outside world. At this time, although he had the initial qualification to integrate into the great Tianyuan world, it was only the initial stage. If he really wanted to make a difference, it was necessary to improve his own strength and cultivation. Because he had already solved the two basic problems, the Avatar no longer needed any help from the main body in the primordial world. He did not have anything to pass to the main body. Therefore, during the process of passing through the passageway, he did not contact the main body again. This period of time was not too long, or rather, it was not too long compared to the previous 400,000 years. Based on what he sensed, about 800 years later, somewhere in his line of sight, there was suddenly an incomparably dark, like a bottomless abyss, leading to an unfathomable strange cave. This cave looked extremely similar to the entrance of the passage that he had seen in the small world of the untainted land, and it even felt exactly the same. At this moment, Luo Fan instantly understood that he had reached the other entrance of the passage. Behind this is the great Tianyuan world. Luo Fan stopped moving. A kind of excitement, anticipation, and anxiety filled his mind, making it almost impossible for him to maintain a calm expression. Of course, after all, he was in existence with a perfect mind and Taoist heart. After a short while, he completely stabilized his emotions. With a slight thought, his figure gradually disappeared, gradually fading into nothingness. Only endless energy flowed and surged like flowing water where his body originally was. All traces of his existence disappeared completely in an instant. This method was none other than a kind of concealment method that he had derived from the two cultivation methods. Although the two cultivation methods were divided into two parts, their essence was the same. They both comprehended the essence of the great Tianyuan world, and they both integrated into the power of the great Tianyuan world. This method naturally had a concealment method that completely integrated into the energy of the great Tianyuan world. As for how powerful this concealment method was, and whether it could hide from saint-level existences, Luo Fan naturally could not be certain. After all, he could not imagine what kind of incredible magic a saint-level existence possessed. However, this kind of concealment technique had already reached the limit of what he could do. Everything that he could conceal had already been completely concealed. Everything that he could fuse with the surrounding energy, using the surging energy waves to conceal himself, had already been fused with it. If he still could not escape the detection of a saint-level existence under these circumstances, then Luo Fan would have no other choice but to abandon this clone. The so-called doing one's best and leaving it up to the will of the heavens was nothing more than this. With a thought, an inexplicable connection was established between the clone and the original body. This time, it did not transmit too much information. It directly shared all of its senses through various complicated processes, allowing the main body to sense everything it could sense as if it was experiencing it personally. At this moment, the clone was contacting the original body on a day 3,000 years after the clone had entered the passage. It was also the longest distance between the clone and the original body. At this moment, Luo Fan's original body was still sitting at the entrance of the passage. Suddenly, he sensed that the clone was contacting him through the spiritual connection, and he knew that the clone had reached the exit of the passage. He could not help but withdraw most of his consciousness that had entered the Wuji Palace to comprehend the inspiration of living beings, and return to his original body. He locked onto the mysterious spiritual connection, and worked hard to comprehend the various things that the clone had transmitted to him. The clone and the original body were the same self, had the same intelligence, and had the same mind. Hence, the original body naturally had no doubts about the clone's purpose. He did not need to say anything at all to understand that the clone was prepared for the worst. If the saint detected it, the clone would transmit the scene of the moment the saint made a move, in case he ended up empty-handed. However, the possibility of such a saint making a move is not too high. Although he had prepared for the worst, Luo Fan's original body did not think that such a bad possibility would appear. The saint was omnipotent. If he really valued the untainted land and this passage, how could he have allowed the human venerable to enter the untainted land alone through this passage? Even if this passage was only for disbanded celestials of the great all-embracing heaven, what would happen if dozens, hundreds, or thousands of disbanded celestials of the great all-embracing heaven were sent? He could not do it. The saint did not have that many disbanded celestials of the great all-embracing heaven. Therefore, judging from the fact that the human venerable had entered the untainted land alone, the saint should not have attached much importance to this passage. Since he did not attach much importance to it, he naturally would not pay attention to this place all the time. It was possible that he had arranged for some existences at the great all-embracing heaven level to guard this passage. In this way, although entering the great Tianyuan world would still have to take a lot of risks, after all, it was not impossible to succeed. While the original body was thinking, Luo Fan's clone had already begun to slowly move toward the entrance of the passage. This passage was very mysterious, but after all, it required an infinite amount of energy to maintain, and it could even be said that it consumed an infinite amount of energy at every moment. Therefore, although the entrance looked dark, as if even light could not enter, in fact, there must be an infinite amount of energy pouring in from it, constantly replenishing the passage's consumption. Only in this way could the integrity of this passage be maintained. Under such circumstances, the power at the entrance of the passage surged, and naturally, there was an infinite amount of energy that was collided and agitated, changing the direction of its flow. Therefore, when the infinite amount of energy poured in, there was still a lot of it gushing out. In this way, it was not too abrupt for Luo Fan to leave this passage with the help of energy, and it was not impossible. Luo Fan's clone slowly moved toward the entrance of the passage. After a few hundred breaths, he had already come into contact with the wonderful barrier at the entrance of the passage. Although this passage needed to receive an infinite amount of energy from the great Tianyuan world to maintain its integrity, after all, the passage formed its own space and time, and it was fundamentally different from the great Tianyuan world outside the passage. Therefore, there was still some kind of barrier between the two. Although this barrier did not prevent energy from entering or leaving, it was still rather tough. When he came into contact with this barrier, Luo Fan felt an indescribable majesty penetrate his bones. This majesty was boundless and possessed unbelievable power. It was as if a sliver of it could completely wipe out Luo Fan's clone, his original body far away in the primordial world, and all existences related to him. Sensing the power of this barrier, Luo Fan could not help but feel nervous. From the looks of this barrier, if he triggered this barrier's counterattack, not only would his clone be killed, even his original body would be wiped out. This was different from what he had imagined, so how could he not feel nervous? However, the arrow was already knocked on the bowstring, and it had to be released. Now that he was already here, how could Luo Fan not give up without trying? Therefore, his clone clenched his teeth and crashed into the barrier like a stream of water. The barrier had no effect on the energy. In just an instant, Luo Fan's doppelganger felt as if it had passed through endless space and time. An incomparably vicissitude, vast and mysterious aura assaulted his face. In an instant, his entire body, from the core of his divine soul to the ends of his pores, had been thoroughly soaked. So this is the great Tianyuan world. As expected, this is the great Tianyuan world. Luo Fan could not help but let out an inexplicable sigh. No matter how detailed the human venerable's description was, no matter how much he learned about the situation of the great Tianyuan world from the human venerable, when he truly entered the great Tianyuan world, he realized just how feeble words were. He realized just how majestic, vast, and mysterious the real great Tianyuan world was. Therefore, he had such a complicated sigh. To be continued. Chapter 754. At this time, Luo Fan's doppelganger was still in that state of concealment, merging with the energy of the surrounding Tianyuan great world. It was constantly flowing against the flow of energy, heading away from the passage. Text first. Right now, he was in a small world. This small world was not vast, only tens of thousands of miles in circumference. Moreover, the strength of the space and the stability of the space-time barrier were only average, comparable to that of a medium-sized world, but much weaker than that of the vast thousand world, let alone the untainted land. This small world was obviously the same as the one at the entrance of the passage between the untainted land and the untainted land. It was also attached to this passage and existed because of the infinite power of this passage. From this point of view, the strength of the space of this small world and the stability of the space-time barrier were obviously strong to an unimaginable level. What made Luo Fan sigh with emotion just now was partly because of this small world, but more because his perception directly broke through the space-time barrier of this small world and sensed the vast and infinite Tianyuan great world outside this small world. He sensed the vicissitudes, vastness, and mystery of the Tianyuan great world. Although the greatest danger had passed after leaving the passage, for this doppelganger, it did not mean that it was completely safe. Even on the other side of the passage in the untainted land, there was a human venerable, a disbanded immortal of the great all-embracing heaven, guarding it. If there were no powerful practitioners guarding here, Luo Fan would not believe it. He still did not cut off the connection with his body. He moved slowly and carefully, trying to get rid of the influence of the endless surging energy. This energy was not acquired chi of heaven and earth, but some kind of mysterious energy that had undergone mysterious changes and become more active and easier to transform, but did not belong to the congenital realm. Luo Fan sensed slightly and already knew the source of this energy. Unlike the other exit in the untainted land, this passage was not under a spirit mountain. On the contrary, it was on a high altar. This altar was more than 100 feet high and occupied a radius of 100 feet. The whole altar was built with a material that Luo Fan had never seen before. There were countless symbols and light spots moving and flashing on it. The endless energy that kept gushing into the passage was generated from every part of the altar. In the end, it gathered at the top of the altar and poured into the passage. Even to Luo Fan, that energy seemed to be boundless and unimaginably vast. However, it seemed to pose no pressure to the altar at all. It didn't affect the altar at all, and it didn't make the altar ask for energy from the outside world. The altar looked like it had nothing to do with the world around it. It was as if they would never affect each other. Faintly, he seemed to be at ease. The moment Luo Fan sensed the source of the energy, he discovered the mysteriousness of the altar. However, even though he had sensed it, he still couldn't figure out what mysteries it contained. He could only sigh inwardly that the ability of a saint was indeed beyond his understanding at the moment. He moved bit by bit, and after a while, he finally moved his body out of the place where the energy surged. The way he hid his body also changed slightly. Outside the endless energy was the area enveloped by the Hotian Yuan Qi of the world. If he did not change his way of hiding and maintain the same way as when he was in the flow of energy, it would be difficult for him to achieve his goal of hiding. The difference between the energy and the Hotian Yuan Qi of the world would naturally highlight his existence. Although the energy was different from the Hotian Yuan Qi of the world, it was formed after the Hotian Yuan Qi underwent a certain transformation. Therefore, it also contained the mysteries of the Hotian Yuan Qi. With this premise, Luo Fan comprehended the various mysteries of the energy, which naturally included the mysteries of the Hotian Yuan Qi of the world. In this way, it was naturally not difficult for him to merge with the Hotian Yuan Qi of the world and achieve the effect of the two completely merging. After a while, when his body was completely out of the range of the surging energy, he had completely changed his way of hiding. He had already completely changed his method of searching. After determining a direction, he unhurriedly followed the flow of the Hotian Yuan Qi of heaven and earth in that direction. This world was tens of thousands of miles wide. There were mountains, plains, hills, lakes, and rivers. Everything seemed to be no different from the real world. As for the existence that guarded this small world and the passage, it hid itself and merged into the myriad of living beings, causing Luo Fan to only be able to faintly sense a powerful presence. However, he was unable to tell exactly where it was, much less know how powerful it was. But no matter what, it was safer to be cautious than to be careless and not care about anything. With this mentality, Luo Fan spent several hours before he followed the flow of the Hotian Yuan Qi and arrived at his destination. This was the place where the small world and the great Tianyuan world intersected. It was just like the place where the small world and the great Tianyuan world intersected. The strength of the space and the space-time barrier at this place were the weakest in the entire small world. It was also the place that caused the least disturbance when he broke through and left. It was also the place that was most likely to not attract the attention of the existence that guarded this small world. After arriving at this place, Luo Fan no longer hesitated. With a thought, a suction force was produced and directly blasted toward that place. The suction force was so powerful that it instantly tore open the space-time barrier and revealed the scene of the outside world. At this moment, Luo Fan's figure directly shot toward the outside world like an arrow. Although all these happened in an instant, and Luo Fan tried his best to suppress and conceal it, it was obvious that the fluctuation and the impact could not be hidden from the existence that guarded this small world. In that instant, an extremely powerful aura suddenly rose from somewhere in the small world, filling the world in an instant. The moment he sensed the aura, Luo Fan understood how correct his previous caution was. The aura contained the will of a great perfection, eternal and indestructible. It was the aura of a zenith heaven golden immortal. After the aura soared into the sky, a faint voice began to reverberate throughout the small world. You're just a seventh-stage immortal, and yet you dare to attack the passage created by a sage. How audacious of you! As he spoke, the vitality, rules, and even the great Tao in the small world began to undergo an extremely mysterious change. An invisible giant palm suddenly condensed from the void, and with all the vitality, rules, and the power of the small world, it fiercely shrouded the place where Luo Fan was. Although Luo Fan was prepared to withstand a powerful attack, the attack came too quickly. It was so fast that he could barely gather the power of his body to block it, and he was directly slapped by the giant palm. This slap. It was as if a huge mountain had pressed down on him when he was still a mortal, instantly smashing all his energy and even affecting his body. The body that he had spent 360,000 years to condense was smashed into a ragged bag. The power that he had condensed in this body was completely smashed in an instant and poured out from the countless holes in his body. At this moment, his spirit also suffered an almost unbearable power. Most of his spirits were scattered and turned into nothingness. Only the deepest and most tenacious spirit was left, which barely managed to stay intact and clear. Carried by his broken body, it rushed out of the small world and into the great world of heaven's origin. Luo Fan's original body, which was far away in the untainted land, only had time to glance at the vast great Tianyuan world. The connection between the original body and the clone was cut off, and it was difficult to see where the clone was. I almost failed at the last moment. Luo Fan's original body sighed slightly, and there was a look of relief on his face. Although the connection between the clone and the original body was cut off, it was his clone after all. However, that was his clone after all. Whether he was alive or not, his main body would naturally be able to sense it. Therefore, at this moment, Luo Fan knew that the clone was still alive, although it seemed to be in a sorry state. After sighing, his original body did not waste any more time. He continued to focus his mind on the Wuji Palace of the Void, and continued to comprehend the inspiration of the endless living beings that were produced at every moment. In the small world of the great Tianyuan world, after slapping Luo Fan's figure out of the small world, the indifferent voice resounded again. This time, I'll teach you a lesson. If you don't die, remember not to attack the passageway again to seek death. After that, the space-time barrier was restored, and the aura of a zenith heaven golden immortal that filled the small world also disappeared. The giant hand directly dissipated, and all the abnormal fluctuations and abnormal energy flows in the small world also calmed down. Everything returned to before Luo Fan appeared, as if nothing had happened. Fortunately, I used the suction force just now. Otherwise, I'm afraid it would not be so easy to escape this time. At this moment, Luo Fan's clones secretly rejoiced. Even though countless changes occurred in the blink of an eye, he was able to see everything clearly, and he knew that he was truly extremely lucky to be able to escape like this. The root cause was that he used the suction force to split open the spacetime barrier. The reason why using the suction force to split open the spacetime barrier had such an advantage was because the suction force made it seem like the living beings of the great Tianyuan world wanted to break through the spacetime barrier and rush into this small world. Although the existence that guarded the small world and the passageway was extremely powerful, after all, it did not pay full attention to that position. Instead, it was enjoying itself in the small world, enjoying some kind of pleasure. He found that when the spacetime barrier was blasted open, the spacetime barrier was already a thing of the past. What was left was only a little bit of aura and a lot of yuan qi fluctuations. In this case, he naturally could not directly determine whether a living being had blasted open the spacetime barrier from the outside or from the inside. Therefore, he could only rely on the aura, the yuan qi fluctuations, the residual power, and various kinds of common sense to make inferences. The result of these inferences was obviously that some powerful cultivators of the outside Great Tianyuan world wanted to enter the passage and blast open the space-time barrier. If he made a more daring guess, perhaps there should be many such powerful cultivators in the years after the passage was formed. The Zenith Heaven Golden Immortal should also have some experience, so he could easily determine that it was a cultivator from the outside world who had blasted open the space-time barrier. Because of these various reasons, Luo Fan's previous encounter and Luo Fan's current escape came about. Luo Fan naturally would not put too much energy into such conjectures. At this moment, Luo Fan guarded his mind, worked hard to condense his spirit, converged his own power, and maintained the integrity of his body. Just now, he was hit by the power of the small world that the Zenith Heaven Golden Immortal had condensed. Although he had escaped, he was still severely injured after all. At this moment, he was even a little dizzy and felt that his thinking had been affected. In a trance, he felt that he had already flown for tens of thousands of miles. Then, he suddenly stopped and felt pain all over his body. There was endless resistance in front of him, as if his body had crashed into some kind of incomparably hard material, constantly going deeper and deeper, constantly rubbing against it. It seemed that he had traveled for hundreds of miles before finally stopping in the depths of the hard material. Luo Fan did not pay too much attention to the changes in his surroundings. Although his body was severely injured, his Zenith Heaven Golden Immortal essence was still present. Ordinary changes in the natural environment did not affect him much at all. As long as he was not attacked by powerful cultivators, he would not be in too much danger. In such a situation where there was no danger, he naturally would not be too concerned about the changes in the environment. At this moment, the injuries he had suffered were extremely severe. If it had been an ordinary zenith heaven golden immortal, it would have taken hundreds of millions of years to recover. But for him, such injuries did not need to be so severe. This body, the power within this body and the spirit within it were condensed from the two cultivation techniques that he had obtained by reversing karma. With his mastery of the two cultivation methods, even if his body was shattered, even if his soul was completely destroyed, as long as his life imprint and life essence were not completely destroyed, he could recover through various means. Moreover, the difficulty of recovering was definitely tens of thousands of times less than that of ordinary cultivators. Under such circumstances, he wanted to recover his body's injuries. Naturally, it was much easier than ordinary zenith heaven golden immortals. Luo Fan's doppelganger was lying there quietly. The fragments of his divine soul were constantly gathering towards his doppelganger, reassembling his divine soul bit by bit. During the process, the two cultivation techniques that had been engraved in the depths of his life essence and were only a step away from transcending the past and the future naturally began to circulate. They began to use an incredibly profound and complicated method that was compatible with a certain supreme law of the great heaven primordial world to refine his spirit and body. Just like that, his spirit gradually began to improve bit by bit as it condensed, becoming purer bit by bit. Although the entire process was slow, it was incredibly steady. It was as if he was breaking steel and refining it again, continuously strengthening the foundation of his spirit. His body also went through the same process. His body, which was almost unstoppable like a broken bag, had endless life force being produced from the depths of his body. It constantly filled his body and healed his injuries. During the process, it constantly healed every part of his body that was injured, making them stronger than before and harder to be injured. The entire process did not seem to be healing his injuries. Instead, it was more like a cultivation process. As his divine soul and body recovered, the power in his body also began to circulate naturally. The power that had been scattered but still remained in his body began to condense again. His body began to emit a faint, strange light. The light was formless and colorless, as if it was completely transparent. It did not seem like there were any elements that could be sensed by sight, but anyone could tell that it was a kind of light. It was an extremely profound light that contained endless mysteries. It was extremely pure, extremely bright, extremely powerful and extremely firm. As the light enveloped him, the tough matter that had been restraining him gradually began to be pushed away. Like it was made of sponge, it was squeezed out into a spherical space that was several hundred feet wide. Luo Fan's body had unknowingly shifted from lying down to sitting cross-legged. His gorilla-like body exuded a supreme aura of perfection. His entire body seemed to be a world of its own, a universe of its own. Luo Fan's clone had crashed into the middle of a mountain that was over 3 million feet tall. The trajectory he had taken was slanted, forming a diagonal line from top to bottom. At this moment, he was a few hundred kilometers below the center of the mountain that was over 3 million feet tall. A few dozen kilometers below him, there was a river formed from the natural chi of the world. The river was in a spiral shape and it started from somewhere below. It spiraled upwards and in the end it flowed out of the mountain. After reaching a few thousand kilometers away, it gradually dissipated and disappeared. The place where the river of origin chi had formed was directly opposite where Luo Fan was. There seemed to be some sort of connection between their positions, causing strands of strange existences to surge towards where Luo Fan was through the ground, vaguely wrapping around Luo Fan. These strange existences were formless and intangible. Even Luo Fan could not sense their existence at the moment. He only felt that his body and mind were extremely familiar, and it was much easier for him to focus his mind than before. The mountain that was over 3 million feet tall only covered an area of several thousand kilometers. Compared to its height, it was not very vast. The mountain was covered with all kinds of strange animals and plants, and there were even many powerful creatures entrenched in it. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to vote for me at Chidien. Your support is my greatest motivation. More address. Chapter 755. Time passed quickly. In the blink of an eye, 3,000 years had passed. Text first. On this day, somewhere in the great Tianyuan world, a muffled rumble of thunder suddenly rang out from within a mountain that was over 3 million meters tall. At first, this sound was indistinct and practically undetectable. However, along with the passage of time, this muffled sound grew stronger and more obvious. In the end, after a few dozen breaths of time, it was as if the entire heavens and the earth had started to tremble. Within the muffled sound, there was gradually an inconceivable majesty. Any living creature that heard the sound, even plants without consciousness, could not help but panic and shrink into a ball as they trembled. Even the many powerful creatures that occupied the 3-million-meter-tall mountain were no exception. Occasionally, one or two powerful creatures could break free from the majestic pressure and let out a roar or two, but that was all. Under the muffled sound, the entire mountain became deathly silent. It was as if the originally lively scene had never appeared. At this moment, several hundred kilometers below the mountain, Luo Fan's clone sat cross-legged and floated in a patch of light. The spiraling Yuan-Chi River dozens of kilometers below had undergone tremendous changes compared to 3,000 years ago. The amount of Yuan-Chi was still the same as before, but the vitality that was originally contained in the Yuan-Chi River had completely disappeared. Although it still looked no different from 3,000 years ago, anyone with a bit of cultivation could tell that the river had lost something important. The river had lost something of its greatest importance. There was something important that made this river so profound that it could give birth to countless mysterious creatures. The origin of the Yuan-Chi River, which was also where its core was, had undergone a drastic change. Although there was still Yuan-Chi continuously flowing out from it, it was like a water pipe that was flowing with dirty water. The mysterious and unfathomable feeling that it gave people had already completely disappeared. As for the strange existence that flowed out and wrapped around Luo Fan, it had completely disappeared. There was no trace of it at all. It was clear that the existence of Luo Fan's clone had disappeared during the 3,000 years. The strange existence had been completely consumed. The effect of this strange existence was also quite shocking. It didn't enter Luo Fan's body, didn't transform into any of his power, and didn't strengthen his body in the slightest. Even his soul, will, and mind weren't strengthened. However, it had shortened Luo Fan's recovery process, which should have taken tens of thousands of years, to 3,000 years. Yes, at this moment, the various injuries that Luo Fan suffered had completely recovered, and it was even to the extent that because of this cycle of being injured and recovering, his body, soul, will, and consciousness had become a few times stronger than before he was injured. Even the foundation of his cultivation had been strengthened, becoming hundreds of times more stable than when he had first formed this body. Although he still needed to readjust his cultivation in the future to achieve a breakthrough in the most perfect state, the power of his current divine ability was 100 times stronger than when he first stepped into the great Tianyuan world. This kind of improvement was naturally far from being able to compare to a breakthrough in cultivation realm. But within the same realm, this kind of improvement was quite good. At this moment, the huge muffled sound that shook the entire 3-million-foot-tall mountain came from none other than Luo Fan's clone. Moreover, it wasn't the effect of any divine ability or technique, but the sound of the blood that circulated in Luo Fan's body. Whoosh, 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 the sound that sounded like ocean waves kept ringing out from his body, stirring up the boundless Hotian Yuan-Chi in the surroundings and spreading outwards. The more it spread out, the louder it became, as if it was absorbing some kind of energy. Luo Fan's majesty, which originally belonged to him, was being stimulated more and more. In the end, it even caused the entire mountain to tremble slightly. combined with the muffled rumbles coming from the Hotian Yuan Qi of the world, the majesty contained within it combined with the might of the world. Instead, it skyrocketed by who knew how many times. It was precisely because of this that such an unbelievable result occurred. The muffled sound lasted for 3 days and 3 nights. On the night of the 3rd day there was finally a change. It allowed all living beings on the mountain, who had been suppressed for 3 days and 3 nights, to escape the fate of being suppressed to the point of being unable to move. After 3 days and 3 nights, Luo Fan's body trembled slightly. When his eyes, which he had not opened even once in 3,000 years, slowly opened, there seemed to be 2 abysses spinning within them, devouring everything he saw. With this action, time and space within the range of the entire mountain seemed to come to an abrupt halt. All the movements of all living beings stopped in that instant. Even the flow of the Yuan Qi in the air, and the rustling of the grass in the wind, seemed to have stopped in that instant. Then, the sound of blood flowing in his body suddenly disappeared. His entire sense of existence disappeared in that instant. Forget about not looking with one's eyes. Even if one looked with one's eyes, one would unknowingly ignore him. Even if one saw him, one would feel as if he did not exist at all, as if this place was completely empty. It's finally done. Luo Fan straightened his body. As the power in his body fluctuated, there was a faint sound of thunder. However, after this sound of thunder came out, it also disappeared very quickly, making it impossible for people to notice Luo Fan because of this sound of thunder. After carefully feeling his own body, Luo Fan shook his head, as if he was quite dissatisfied. The realm of these 2 cultivation methods still hasn't improved, and the realm of cultivation is limited to the level of a disbanded celestial of the great all-embracing heaven. I haven't even broken through to a true celestial of the great all-embracing heaven. This speed of progress is really not ideal. He sighed to himself. With a thought, he took a step forward, and his body had already landed at the source of the origin Qi River dozens of miles below him. At this time, he was only a disbanded celestial of the great all-embracing heaven. But he also had infinite magical powers. Going from heaven to earth, going through fire and diving into the sea was nothing to him. How could these dozens of miles of ground mean anything to him? Is this the thing that has been nourishing me for the past 3,000 years? Luo Fan thought to himself, carefully observing the source of the origin Qi. All the origin Qi of heaven and earth was born by heaven and earth. That was why it was endless and never stopped. After all, as long as a cultivator could absorb the origin Qi within the endurance of heaven and earth, it was insignificant compared to a vast and incomparable heaven and earth. They were all insignificant. As long as every part of the void produced a little bit of Yuan Qi, they would be able to make up for it completely. That was to say, for the boundless thousand world. It didn't matter how many cultivators there were in the 3 realms of Tai. No matter how many there were, no matter how much they absorbed, it was impossible to exhaust the origin Qi of a boundless thousand world. As long as the explosion of suction did not exceed the limit, heaven and earth could immediately replenish the origin Qi. For the untainted land, the limit was raised to the 3 realms of the great all-embracing heaven. For the Tianyuan Great World where Luo Fan's clone was at, the limit would be raised to the Sage Realm. That was to say, to the primordial world. It did not matter how many cultivators there were in the 3 realms of the Zenith Heaven. It would not damage its foundation at all. To the Tianyuan Great World, sages were like the 3 realms of the Zenith Heaven in the primordial world. They were not afraid no matter how many there were. From this, it could be seen how huge the difference in essence between the primordial world and the Tianyuan Great World was. Let's not talk about him first. At that moment, let's talk about the origin Qi. Although the origin Qi was naturally born from the entire world, it was endless and would never be cut off. However, there were differences in the density and thinness of the origin Qi. The carrier of the origin Qi. Naturally, there was a difference. For example, The origin Qi river that was so dense that it had condensed into liquid could not be naturally born from the void. However, it was born from an object that had a strange connection with the world and could conform to certain rules, laws, and even great Tao. That was the only way to produce such a huge amount of origin Qi in such an extravagant manner. At that moment, in front of Luo Fan, there was such an object. However, although the spiral origin Qi river looked extremely huge, even in the primordial world, it was just a small stream. It was only a small stream, and it was even more insignificant in the great Tianyuan world. Thus, as the source of the river of vitality, it was naturally impossible for this object to be too profound. At most, it would only slightly conform to some indescribable laws. The object was about 10 feet tall and was ellipsoidal in shape. It was like a giant egg that was 10 feet tall. There were 9 orifices on the surface of the giant egg, which were distributed according to the 9 palaces. The endless origin Qi flowed out of the 9 orifices like blood. It seems that this object should be compatible with the rules that have a miraculous healing effect. What I sensed in the past 3,000 years should be the natural attachment of that kind of rule. It's a pity that if I didn't exist, this object would probably be able to break through and grow into a real living being after billions of years. Luo Fan sighed. Although this was the Tianyuan Great World, and the rules, laws, and great Tao were different from the primordial world, the most basic principles would not be too different. Hence, he could tell at a glance that this object was not just a carrier of the source of origin Qi. In reality, it was a weak spirit seed. The 9 orifices were the external manifestation of the spirit seed. Although the origin Qi river constantly flowed through the 9 orifices, it also continuously guided certain rules of the Tianyuan Great World into its body during the process, constantly enriching the spirit seed it possessed. After a long period of time, the spirit seed would have gathered enough rules and become strong enough. Then, it would naturally break out of its shell, leave its stone egg form, and turn into a living being. It was just that this stone egg seemed to have experienced millions of years of growth, but its spirit seed was still weak and could not stabilize itself at all. In the process of being drawn into it, it was also affected by the spirit seed and naturally acted in accordance with the spirit seed. As for the spirit seed, according to Luo Fan's conjecture, it should be helpful in healing. The result was obvious. When Luo Fan was several dozen kilometers away, under the guidance of the laws, the spirit seed inside the stone egg released the laws it had gathered for millions of years in a daze, instinctively helping Luo Fan. In 3,000 years, the spirit seed's millions of years of hard work had dissipated, causing the spirit seed to be on the verge of collapse. At the same time, it affected the endless energy that flowed out, causing the energy to change like this. I don't need your help. But you've helped me a little too. Luo Fan let out a sigh and said. With that, he raised his hand and grabbed at the stone egg without any hesitation. Invisible laws appeared naturally and pierced into the stone egg like silk threads. They wrapped around the spiritual seed inside the egg that was on the verge of collapse. In the blink of an eye, the spiritual seed was wrapped into a silk cocoon. The spirit seed instinctively wanted to live. Previously, it had been affected by the laws without caring about its own life, but that was only because it was too weak compared to the laws. At this moment, the laws gathered around it. How could it let it go? It guided the laws into its body, continuously strengthening its essence and strengthening the spirit seed. The laws flowed endlessly. The spiritual seed grew at an unimaginable speed as it continued to gush into it. The boundless vitality that flowed out of the stone egg's 9 orifices also began to change during this process. There was more and more vitality, and the vitality became richer. However, the nature of the vitality was also slightly different from before. Acquired origin Qi was a general term. It contained countless attributes, but it was not the only one. It was also the foundation of cultivation methods with different attributes. Hence, because different origin qi sources were compatible with different rules, laws, and great Tao, the origin qi born would naturally have different attributes and natures. The spirit seed inside the stone egg had already stabilized. Luo Fan secretly estimated that it would probably take tens of millions of years for the spirit seed to grow to the point where it could break out of its shell. He nodded and allowed the laws to continuously flow into the spirit seed to strengthen it. He turned around and took a step forward. His figure slowly dissipated like a cloud of dust before finally disappearing. Halfway up the mountain, at the entrance that Luo Fan's body had been sent flying into, Luo Fan's figure seemed to condense out of nowhere. It turned from illusory to solid and gradually appeared. Phew! He floated in the air. Luo Fan let out a long sigh. There was a faint smile on his face. He seemed happy and worried, but there was also a faint sense of excitement and anticipation. Although he had entered the great Tianyuan world for thousands of years, this was the first time that Luo Fan had clearly seen what the great Tianyuan world looked like. The giant looked around. The entire world was vast and boundless. Even if he stood on the mountain and looked around, he would see no end. The great Tianyuan world was naturally not inferior to the great Thousand world. What attracted Luo Fan the most was the incomparable vicissitude of time that was revealed in the surrounding world. It was this vicissitude of time that made the surrounding world, which looked no different from the untainted world at first glance, completely different from the untainted world. It made the world feel so grand and majestic. Although he did not see the entire world, he could only see the world that spanned hundreds of thousands of kilometers. However, it was enough for Luo Fan to clearly feel that the world in front of him had a story that was hundreds of millions of times richer than the untainted world. It had a history that was hundreds of millions of times longer than the untainted world. The aura of age that was everywhere and the traces of time that could be seen everywhere told him this. Compared to this world, even though the untainted world had been created for hundreds of yuan hui, it was still like a baby crying piteously for food. Traces of immaturity could be seen everywhere. He raised his hand and waved. A stone the size of a human head appeared in front of Luo Fan from the surface of the mountain below. This is the foundation. Luo Fan looked at the stone and could not help but sigh. Even this stone that he casually took out had a history of billions of years. If he carefully sensed it, he could even sense the traces left on it over billions of years. He could also sense how the stone had gradually weathered from a huge stone that was thousands of feet in diameter to its current appearance. Although the material of this stone was so ordinary that it was not worth mentioning, if it was given to any innate god in the untainted world, he might be able to sense some cultivation methods related to time and time from the traces left on it. Just an ordinary stone had such a wonderful effect. It was no wonder that Luo Fan sighed with emotion. With a sigh, Luo Fan casually grabbed the stone, and it turned into powder. With a gentle breeze, it drifted away. All the natural qi in the great Tianyuan world had been transformed into the most stable acquired qi of heaven and earth, but this did not mean that the cultivation environment here was bad. On the contrary, the cultivation environment of the great Tianyuan world was quite good. The density of the qi in this world had reached an unimaginable level. In terms of density, it was thousands of times denser than the density of the untainted world's primordial qi. Logically speaking, such a dense qi should have condensed into a liquid long ago. It was even possible for it to condense into a solid. However, this was clearly not the case. Looking up at the top of the mountain, even at the place with the densest concentration of vitality, the vitality was only condensed into the form of mist, not to mention that the concentration of vitality was only at the waist of the mountain. The reason for this was very simple. It was because the space-time stability of the great Tianyuan world was much higher. The space-time stability of the great Tianyuan world was tens of thousands of times stronger than that of the untainted world. With this degree of space-time stability, It was almost impossible to distort it without the cultivation of the Tai realm. To shatter the void, it required at least the cultivation of the disbanded immortal of the great all-embracing heaven. To be continued. Chapter 756. The stability of spacetime allowed the great Tianyuan world to have an extraordinary capacity to accommodate matter, be it tangible or intangible. Text first. This capacity allowed all living beings in the great Tianyuan world to rise to a higher realm. For example, there was no limit to the number of saint-level existences in the great Tianyuan world. Similarly, this capacity also allowed the gaseous yuan energy to maintain a higher concentration. In other words, the yuan energy that could be condensed into a liquid or solid state in other parts of the world was still able to maintain its gaseous state in this part of the world. This degree of stability of spacetime could be said to be the most obvious difference between the great Tianyuan world and the primordial world. It also had the greatest impact. The greatest impact it had on Luo Fan was naturally not its ability to accommodate all tangible and intangible things, but the degree of stability of space and time. It made it countless times more difficult for him to distort time and speed up the flow of time where he was. Although he did not test it, as long as he sensed the stability of space and time, Luo Fan knew that what he could do in the primordial world, which was tens of millions of times faster than the outside world, could no longer be done here. Even if it was like in the primordial world, where rings of worlds were created, it was impossible to achieve this. In this position, the speed at which he could accelerate time was not more than 10 times faster. Even if he stacked them layer by layer, he could only accelerate the flow of time 1,000 times faster than in the outside world at most. This degree of acceleration was already quite astonishing in the eyes of mortals, but to an existence like Luo Fan, who could use a year as tens of millions of years, it was as if there was no acceleration at all. Sighing slightly, Luo Fan was just about to leave when a roar suddenly came from not far away. Along with the roar, a pillar of fire with a strong whistling sound rushed towards Luo Fan from the place where the roar came from, tearing apart the origin energy. The pillar of fire was blazing white. It roasted the surrounding void and the mountain below. As it advanced, an indescribable heat rushed towards Luo Fan. The mountain below began to turn black as the pillar of fire advanced, and the surrounding vegetation began to burn in an instant. In an instant, the surroundings turned into a sea of fire. He actually dared to make a move. I didn't want to fight here, but it seems that my first fight after coming to the great Tianyuan world won't be in any other place. This thought flashed through Luo Fan's mind. After the thought flashed through his mind, he raised his hand and grabbed at the void. The pillar of fire was like plasticine. It was enveloped by an invisible force out of nowhere and started to compress and change shape, changing into all sorts of strange shapes in the void. In the end, it turned into a sphere with a diameter of several thousand feet. It floated above Luo Fan's head. Luo Fan caressed it casually, and the ball formed by the blazing white flames began to gradually retract its heat, and the ball itself began to slowly compress. Not long after, the heat was completely restrained, and the fireball was compressed to the size of a human head. It was like a blazing white glass bead, quietly lying in Luo Fan's hand. How is this possible? A horrified roar came from the source of the pillar of fire. Naturally, the voice spoke in the language of the great Tianyuan world. However, to Luo Fan, he had already learned from the human sovereign what the language of the great Tianyuan world was like. Even if he hadn't heard it before, he would definitely be able to understand it as soon as he heard it. In fact, he would only need a few sentences to easily deduce the entirety of the language. Luo Fan smiled and gently waved his left hand, which didn't catch the fireball. The sea of fire that was spreading in all directions was instantly extinguished. All that was left was the scorched mountain. The vegetation that had been reduced to ashes was still there. He's only just achieved the immortal Tao. He's at most a second-stage immortal, yet he dared to attack me. His courage is truly commendable. Luo Fan smiled. He had already learned from the human sovereign that the great Tianyuan world was divided into realms of cultivation. He knew that before the great Tianyuan world achieved the immortal Tao, it belonged to the mortal realm and was divided into 9 ranks. These 9 ranks didn't have corresponding realms in the great Tao of Tao, but they clearly separated every stage of the immortal Tao for an ordinary being from 0. Update: after achieving the immortal Tao, the great Tianyuan world no longer had any divisions between individual immortals, genuine immortals, golden immortals, and so on. The immortal realm was also divided into 9 ranks. The first rank corresponded to the individual immortal realm, the second rank corresponded to the genuine immortal realm, and so on. Luo Fan was now a disbanded celestial of the great all-embracing heaven. In the great Tianyuan world, he was a 7th stage immortal, and the golden celestial of the great all-embracing heaven who guarded the passageway was a 9th stage immortal in this world. When a practitioner broke through the 9th stage immortal, it was the saint realm, which seemed to be divided into many ranks. However, the human sovereign was only a 7th stage immortal, so he didn't know much about the division of the saint realm. He only heard that it seemed to be divided into 9 ranks, just like the mortal realm and the immortal realm. The creature that had just attacked Luo Fan with a pillar of fire was a creature that had just achieved the genuine immortal realm. In other words, it was at most a 2nd stage immortal. Crossing 5 ranks, this creature had actually dared to attack Luo Fan. Naturally, it was quite courageous. In other words, it was quite unafraid of death. After Luo Fan finished speaking, he casually pointed, and a strange creature struggled and floated up from a patch of grass tens of thousands of feet away. This creature was about 3 feet tall. It had the body of a monkey, but it had 8 arms. Its whole body was covered in hair, and its eyes were full of disbelief and endless anger. Luo Fan gently crooked his finger, and the 8-armed ape floated toward him unhurriedly. In a short while, it arrived in front of him, and Luo Fan placed it in the ashes of the scorched mountain. "Tell me, why did you attack me?" Luo Fan said. "This is my territory. You've crossed the line." The 8-armed ape roared, and a blazing white flame emerged from its body. In the blink of an eye, it looked like a fire monkey. Luo Fan looked around and found that the place he had crashed into had a lot of the 8-armed ape's aura. He knew that at least it was not lying about this, so he said, "Your territory should be occupied by strength. Do you think it's inappropriate for me to occupy such a small territory with my strength? No matter what, this is my territory. If you want to occupy it, you have to defeat me." The 8-armed ape roared, and the flames around its body became even more blazing. The temperature of the surrounding void rose to the critical point of the flames. The mountain below also became boiling hot. It seemed to be dark red, and there were signs of melting. Luo Fan shook his head and sighed. With a sigh, he made a grabbing motion, and an indescribably mysterious power directly drilled into the 8-armed ape's orifices. It directly attacked the 8-armed ape's soul. This place was the Tianyuan Great World, which was completely different from the primordial world. However, the Tianyuan Great World did not lack living creatures. Therefore, although the 8-armed ape's body structure and the power it cultivated were very different from what Luo Fan knew, it still had a soul in its body. The 8-armed ape's soul was also in its head, but it was completely integrated with its brain. They were inseparable. Luo Fan's fingers trembled. That mysterious power controlled the 8-armed ape's spirit soul, which had fused with the 8-armed ape's brain. With this control, the flames around the 8-armed ape trembled slightly, and in a short while, they completely disappeared. Its eyes also became blank, and the angry expression on its face completely disappeared. It became calm and sluggish. Luo Fan said, "Why did you attack me?" "You took away the source of spiritual energy," the 8-armed ape answered blankly. "How did you know that I took away the source of spiritual energy?" Luo Fan frowned and said, "Since you broke through the giant spirit mountain and entered the underground 3,000 years ago, the mountain began to change. The activity of the spiritual energy became lower and lower. It became more and more difficult to absorb and refine it. Today, when you left the underground, the whole mountain shook, and the concentration of the spiritual energy in the mountain dropped by more than 10 times. The source of spiritual energy must be with you," the eight-armed ape answered blankly. Luo Fan didn't peek into the eight-armed ape's memory. What he did was to use his own power to change the eight-armed ape's will and deceive its mind. It was as if he was a machine that had no consciousness and only had memories. No matter what he asked, it would answer honestly. That was the reason why Luo Fan was answering whatever he was asked. Luo Fan frowned and understood what was going on. Over the past 3,000 years, due to the stone egg constantly helping him heal under the influence of the laws, the energy that flowed out of it kept changing. The vitality and life force within it kept fading away. This naturally made the spirit chi absorbed by the many living beings on the mountain harder to refine, and it also contained many impurities. Today, he added the rules to the stone egg, allowing it to recover. However, this was done under the condition of greatly strengthening the spirit seed inside the stone egg. This caused the stone egg to instinctively restrain itself and restrain its spiritual energy. This caused the vitality of the past to be restored, but the speed at which it flowed out became slower. This change was reflected in the outside world, and naturally, the amount of spiritual energy on the mountain naturally decreased. This caused the creatures on the side to misunderstand. "Since you knew that I was healing here for 3,000 years, why didn't you disturb me in the past 3,000 years? Luo Fan sighed and asked. "Your aura is too terrifying. You are at least 3 grades stronger than me. This is no longer something that any king on the mountain can fight against. Therefore, for 3,000 years we pretended that we didn't know and didn't dare to cause trouble for you," the eight-armed ape still answered blankly. After hearing this, Luo Fan finally had no more doubt. He looked up and his eyes penetrated through the layers of barriers. In an instant, he saw all the creatures on the mountain. In his eyes, at this moment, there were 18 creatures on the mountain that were as powerful as the eight-armed ape. According to their respective strengths or attributes, they divided the mountain peak, which was over 3 million meters tall, into 18 regions, with each living being occupying a region. This eight-armed ape was the existence that occupied an area. Below the 18 second-stage immortals, there were hundreds of first-stage immortals and tens of thousands of mortal realm creatures. At this moment, no matter where the living beings were, they were all nervously focusing their attention on where Luo Fan was. Faintly, there were many powers brewing. Clearly, they were all wary of Luo Fan. Seeing this, Luo Fan shook his head and no longer cared about these creatures. He raised his hand and withdrew the mysterious power that had drilled into the eight-armed ape's orifices. As the power was withdrawn, the eight-armed ape's eyes lit up. The confusion in its eyes was swept away, and its expression became lively and angry again. "I didn't take away the source of spiritual energy. If you don't believe me, you can carefully sense the changes in the world's yuan qi," Luo Fan said faintly. Although he could wipe out all the living beings on this mountain with a wave of his hand, there was no need for him to do so, so he reluctantly gave an explanation. The eight-armed ape heard Luo Fan's words. Naturally, it revealed a look of disbelief. However, after all, Luo Fan's strength was many times more powerful than all the creatures on this mountain. Therefore, if there was hope, it naturally didn't want to fight him directly. As such, it could only do as Luo Fan said and carefully sense the surrounding yuan qi. With this, he could not help but reveal a look of surprise. Then, the surprise turned into delight, followed by regret and fear. Just now, the creatures on the mountain had just recovered from the muffled sound caused by the blood flow in Luo Fan's body, so they weren't very clear-headed. They only sensed the most obvious change in the surrounding Yuan Qi, but didn't carefully sense what kind of deep changes had happened to the Yuan Qi. Therefore, they directly thought that the source of the Yuan Qi had been taken away by the creature that rushed out of the passage. At this moment, when he carefully sensed it, he discovered that even though the density of the origin energy in the surroundings had decreased by more than 10 times, the vitality contained within it were many times stronger than it was before. It had not changed for the past 3,000 years. Compared to the past 3,000 years, it was many times stronger. Under this situation, the difficulty of refining Yuan Qi was 100 times easier than 3,000 years ago. The difficulty of cultivation was naturally easier, and the speed of cultivation was even faster. Such a change, if the source of the Yuan Qi had been taken away, he wouldn't believe it even if you beat him to death. At this point, how could he not know that he had misunderstood Luo Fan? How could he not feel regret for attacking Luo Fan without a care for his own life? Feeling fear? An 8-origin misunderstanding. Immortal dares to disrespect an immortal? Damn it. The 8-armed ape instantly knelt down, its head touching the ground. He said in horror. Just now, he dared to cross several realms to attack Luo Fan because he thought that Luo Fan had cut off his path of survival and cut off his hope of improving his cultivation. Therefore, he had no choice but to throw caution to the wind and attack Luo Fan. At this moment, he knew that his path to survival was not cut off. As long as Luo Fan was willing to let him go, then he would have a bright future ahead of him. Naturally, he was terrified, and it was difficult for him to maintain the attitude of facing death calmly. With a thought, Luo Fan changed his mind and said, "I don't need you to die. You were disrespectful to me. I only need you to be my slave for 3,000 years, and then I will let you go." The 8-armed ape didn't expect Luo Fan to say that. He couldn't help but look hesitant. But very quickly, he realized that he had no choice. He could only kowtow helplessly and say, "8-origin greets master." Luo Fan nodded and raised his hand to cover the 8-armed ape. The 8-armed ape felt the power in his body tremble slightly. It suddenly changed the path that he had cultivated for tens of millions of years. It rushed into a path that he was completely unfamiliar with and had never seen before. As his power changed directions, he felt an indescribable pain begin to spread from his soul to every single particle in his body. The pain was so intense that it was unimaginable. It even made him feel as if his entire body and soul were being crushed and turned into fine powder. If he was still able to control his body and speak, his miserable howl would have definitely shaken the heavens and earth, and it would be sufficient to make all the living beings below this 3,000,000-foot-tall mountain tremble in fear and empathize with him. But at this moment, everything he could do was restricted by an indescribably strong power. He couldn't even control his vocal cords, so how could he make a sound? As a result, he could only endure and endure the boundless pain that was enough to make any living being's mind collapse. Right at this moment, billions of beams of light broke through the barrier around his body. Like countless thin steel wires, they completely wrapped up the space around his body in a radius of several dozen feet. The specks of light were densely packed. Although they were scattered, they completely covered the 8-armed ape that was wrapped in the specks of light, making it impossible for the outside world to see through the specks of light to see what kind of change was happening to the 8-armed ape. Many living beings on this 3,000,000 zhang tall mountain paid attention to the changes here in horror. They had fought with the 8-armed ape, but they belonged to the same mountain after all. To outsiders they were like brothers. Seeing the changes happening to the 8-armed ape, they naturally felt the same. Many of them were even filled with endless anger and wanted to come and save the 8-armed ape. Of course, this was just a thought. After all, the lives of others were not as important as their own. They didn't have a friendship with the 8-armed ape that would make them give up their lives to save it. Therefore, although there were countless auras that were eager to give it a try, they eventually calmed down. The eight-armed ape was still in the rays of light. No one knew what was happening. Luo Fan was still floating there, looking at the rays of light and the eight-armed ape indifferently. In the rays of light, the eight-armed ape's body began to gradually change. Countless cracks appeared on the eight-armed ape's body. These cracks increased in number and density. The cracks also became bigger and bigger. After an unknown amount of time, the eight-armed ape's body instantly turned into powder. A creature that looked like a big-headed gorilla suddenly rushed out from the countless pieces of the body. To be continued. Chapter 757. The body of the big-headed gorilla was completely naked, exuding a natural aura. Its compatibility with the surrounding world was many times stronger than that of other creatures. Text first. The blazing white flames were like fire dragons, entwining around its body, circling back and forth. Each of them was very agile, as if they were real living creatures. After the creature appeared, the light naturally disappeared. The fragments of the eight-armed ape's body were also completely burned away by the fire dragons, turning into nothingness. At this moment, the creature seemed to have woken up. It looked up to the sky and let out a long roar. This long roar contained excitement, pain, and indescribable surprise. All the creatures on the mountain looked at the eight-armed ape in surprise. At this moment, almost all the intelligent creatures already knew what had happened. For a moment, countless emotions of regret echoed among the creatures on the mountain. Why wasn't I the one who attacked just now? This thought became the most obvious in the minds of all the creatures on the mountain. The reason for this was because this body was the Kane Taoism body of the great Tianyuan world. This living being was none other than the eight-armed ape. In any world, even in a world like the great Tianyuan world, which was many times stronger than the untainted world, the Kane Taoism body of the world itself was not easy to obtain for creatures who were not born with the Kane Taoism body. It was the same for the great Tianyuan world. Although the cultivation world of the great Tianyuan world was prosperous to an unimaginable level, with all kinds of cultivation theories and cultivation methods, it was so numerous that it could not be clearly described with numbers. However, for foreign cultivators, or in other words, humans who were not from the great Tianyuan world, to obtain the Kane Taoism body that was most suitable for the great Tianyuan world, they still needed to cultivate bit by bit, improve their realm bit by bit, and transform their bodies bit by bit. Only then could they finally succeed. Under such circumstances, at this moment, among the countless creatures on the mountain that was more than 3 million feet high, not even the strongest second-stage immortals could truly cultivate the Kane Taoism body. At most, they would be like the eight-armed ape. It had a rough shape, but it was neither fish nor fowl. With one look, one could tell that it was cultivated by a different species. But at this moment, the eight-armed ape had only been casually pointed at by Luo Fan, and it had directly broken through the shackles that had existed for tens of thousands of years. It had cultivated the innate Taoist aptitude that all creatures dreamed of, and its future cultivation path had become thousands of times smoother than before. This kind of result, even if it was exchanged for 3,000 years of slavery, it would still be worth it even in his dreams. Almost all the creatures on the mountain dreamed of exchanging places with the eight-armed ape. They wanted to be a slave for 3,000 years in exchange for the wonderful fate of cultivating a born Taoism aptitude. Because of this, there were feelings of remorse rippling all over the mountains and plains. The reason why the eight-armed ape was yelling so loudly at this moment was none other than because when Luo Fan had drawn his power to break his own body and cultivate a born Taoism body, his soul, his physical body, and everything else that belonged to him, both tangible and intangible, were transmitting boundless pain to him. Under this pain, his sense of the passage of time was instantly destroyed. In the eyes of the outside world, it was only a short period of time, but in his own perception, it was almost as long as hundreds of millions of years. If it were not for a mysterious force protecting his mind during this process, maybe his mind would have collapsed in this endless pain, and his mind would have perished. However, that power was clearly only able to keep his mind and consciousness from collapsing and disappearing. The pain he was suffering was not reduced because of this. In that seemingly endless period of time, he endured boundless pain. He could not cry out to vent it, nor could he use his movements to weaken it. He could only passively endure this kind of pain bit by bit. That kind of experience, to him, was just thinking about it made his body tremble. At this moment, he was out of that state and felt the wonderful feeling that was everywhere in his body. How could he still suppress his feelings? Just roaring out without destroying everywhere could already be considered his amazing self-control. Luo Fan looked at the eight-armed ape's actions indifferently. He did not feel anything, nor did he have any intention of stopping it. Cultivation was a gradual process. It had its own rules. If one wanted to surpass this rule and compress a process that could take a long time to complete into a very short time, one would naturally have to bear a considerable price. If the eight-armed ape were to perform this action of cultivating the born Taoism aptitude, what awaited him would definitely affect his potential, reducing the possibility of his future cultivation to almost zero. At this time, with Luo Fan performing this action, he could naturally avoid this possibility, so that the acceleration would not affect his cultivation potential, but the pain would not be reduced. The eight-armed ape roared for a long time before it calmed down, but his roar had a considerable impact on the creatures on the mountain. Although the pain in the roar was many times less than what he had endured in the past, many creatures still felt it, making them understand that if they were in the eight-armed ape's position, they would probably suffer the same terrible pain. For a moment, many creatures began to rejoice, feeling that not exchanging positions with the eight-armed ape was actually not a loss, it was the same in any world. Even if they knew that a moment of pain could be exchanged for infinite benefits, most creatures would not be willing to use this kind of pain in exchange. They would rather continue to sink in to avoid this kind of pain. Of course, after all, not all creatures were like this. Although they could hear the pain contained in the eight-armed ape's roar, there were still many creatures who were very envious of the eight-armed ape. Among them, the creatures who were also kings of this mountain, like the eight-armed ape, still envied the eight-armed ape. It could be said that this was the reason why they could become kings. After the eight-armed ape calmed down, it withdrew the blazing white flames around it back into its body. It knelt before Luo Fan naked, kowtowed, and said, "Thank you, Master, for fulfilling my wish. In the future, when I travel the world, it will be very inconvenient for you to not be in human form, so I will fulfill your wish, but there is no need to thank me," Luo Fan said lightly. "No matter what, Master, you helped Ba Yuan cultivate the born Taoism body, so you have given me a new life. You have to thank me." Ba Yuan kowtowed again to thank him. The description and even the name of the born Taoism body in this world were somewhat different from what Luo Fan said in the untainted land. But after all, what Luo Fan understood was the idea in his words. For him, no matter what it was called, it meant born Taoism body, so it could naturally be translated as born Taoism body. Luo Fan smiled and shook his head, but did not say anything else. He only said, "You will be my slave in the future, but you do not need to change your name. You are still Ba Yuan. Get up and put on your clothes before replying." Yuan bowed again and responded. He stood up and with a thought, the flames in his body shook and rushed out from the acupuncture points all over his body. In an instant, the flames condensed and formed a manservant's robe on the surface of his body. After the robe was formed, at this point, Ba Yuan looked like a servant, and it was hard to tell that he was originally an eight-armed ape, a stage 2 immortal. This was the ability to condense the energy in one's body into a robe. To a rank 2 immortal, it was a piece of cake. Even a rank 1 immortal could do it easily. Therefore, even though these robes were formed from flames, they were vivid and lifelike. The flames were restrained and the texture was solid. They looked like real robes, and there was no sign of them being formed from flames. Xiaonu is already dressed. Master, please give me your orders. After Ba Yuan checked his appearance, he stood at the side and replied to Luo Fan. Luo Fan nodded and said, "Where is the nearest city? Lead me there." In reply to Master, the nearest city is Longchuan City. It's 300,000 miles away from here, but it's only a small stage 2 city. It's not even in the top 10 million of the Matian sanctuary, Ba Yuan said. When Luo Fan heard this, he understood where he was at this moment. He had heard about the great Tianyuan world from the human venerable. After such a long time, he had already gained a general understanding of the great Tianyuan world. Naturally, he had a rather broad understanding of the great Tianyuan world. The great Tianyuan world was boundless, and it was tens of thousands of times wider than the untainted land. There were tens of thousands of continents in the entire great Tianyuan world. These continents were distributed in the boundless ocean, and each continent had an area of at least billions of miles. In the ocean, the continents were like stars in the sky, twinkling like stars. These tens of thousands of continents were divided into 2 large regions. One was the 80,000 continents in the center of the great Tianyuan world. When these continents were combined, they were called the sanctuary. The tens of thousands of continents outside the 80,000 continents were called the outer domain, also known as the savage land. Among them, the sanctuary was ruled by the 800 sages. The outer domain, known as the savage land, was a place that the sages had not reached, or rather disdained to reach. Within the sanctuary, each of the 800 sages ruled over 10,000 continents. They had absolute ownership over every continent under their rule. All the energy, materials, and living things in the continents belonged to the sages. This was the most basic rule of the great Tianyuan world. As long as one could become a saint, he or she would be able to naturally control the 10,000 continents and turn everything in them into his or her own. He or she could even directly refine the 10,000 continents, each of which was billions of miles long. At the moment, Luo Fan was at the border of one of the continents in the Matian sanctuary, which belonged to the Matian saint, who had recently become a sage 3 trillion years ago. The Matian sanctuary was also the sanctuary that was closest to the outer region among the 800 sanctuaries. As for Longchuan City, Luo Fan had only heard the human venerable mention it occasionally. Even the sages did not know how many cities there were in the great Tianyuan world. Among them, the cities were also divided into 9 grades. Longchuan City was only a grade 2 city. Not to mention the entire great Tianyuan world, there were billions of such cities in the Matian sanctuary. Under such circumstances, even if Longchuan City was only a few 100,000 miles away from the passageway, the human venerable would not pay too much attention to it. He only knew its name because Longchuan City was so close to this place. Even the human venerable himself did not know much about it. In the 1,000 years that he had spent talking to Luo Fan, it was naturally impossible for him to divulge too much information. "Then let's go to Longchuan City," said Luo Fan with a smile. He had already thought through the situation clearly. Yuan said respectfully. As he spoke, just as he was about to gather his strength to lift Luo Fan and himself up, figures suddenly rushed over from all over the mountain. They were so fast that they seemed to have reached the limit of a grade 2 immortal. In an instant, 13 figures landed in front of Luo Fan and Ba Yuan. They were the 13 rulers of the mountain. Each of them had a rough humanoid shape, which was the outline of the great Tianyuan world's Kanate Taoism physique. However, none of them were authentic. Some had a few heads, some had 3 or 4 legs, and some even had wings. Each and every one of the feathers looked neither fish nor fowl. When these rulers arrived in front of Luo Fan, they immediately knelt down and continuously kowtowed. They said, "We admire immortals so much that we cannot restrain ourselves. We are willing to accompany Great Immortal for a long time. Great Immortal, please accept us." As they spoke, they continuously kowtowed. Luo Fan raised his eyes and swept his gaze over them. He knew what they were thinking and could not help but laugh. I didn't expect this to become so popular. Such a thought flashed through his mind. However, in this thought, he also felt a sense of pity, or rather, he could not bear to see it. Based on what he sensed, even the ones who had cultivated for the shortest amount of time among these creatures had cultivated for tens of millions of years. Even so, they were willing to sell themselves as slaves just for a chance to achieve connate Taoism physique. They were willing to disregard their dignity and face and beg in front of others. How sad was this? How helpless must their lives be to turn them into this? Under such pity, Luo Fan sighed and said, I don't need so many slaves. I have Ba Yuan each, which is barely enough. I won't accept any more of you. Huh. Hearing Luo Fan's resolute refusal, the 13 rulers all looked hopeless. The 13 monarchs all had looks of despair on their faces, and some of them even began to tear up. Immortal, please have mercy on us. However, they were able to muster their courage and naturally would not give up just because of Luo Fan's refusal. They continued to kowtow and beg, hoping that Luo Fan would change his mind and show mercy so that they could get what they wanted. What kind of existence was Luo Fan? His will was countless times stronger than a boulder. Once he decided on something, how could he change his mind just because of a few pleas? Even if he felt pity for these creatures, he would not completely change his way of doing things because of this pity. Therefore, he simply smiled faintly and said, I know that what you seek is not a born Taoism aptitude, but a shortcut in cultivation. In reality, with your abilities, I believe that you have long obtained the method to cultivate a born Taoism aptitude. All you need is a long time to accumulate and cultivate. After a certain amount of time, you will naturally achieve it. Why sell yourself as a slave in exchange for such a shortcut? Immortal, you may not know this. Although we have obtained some cultivation methods for the born Taoism aptitude, those methods are far too difficult to cultivate. With our talents, it is impossible to cultivate without tens of millions of years. The time required is far too long, and our hearts of immortality find it extremely difficult to bear. In the future, even if we manage to cultivate a born Taoism aptitude, it is very likely that we will not have the heart to continue cultivating. Therefore, I beg you, Immortal, to have mercy on us and increase the possibility of us achieving enlightenment, a ruler begged while crying. Immortal, please have mercy on us. The other rulers knelt at the same time and said. Luo Fan's thoughts changed and finally truly understood their worries. He could not help but sigh to himself. With this kind of mentality, perhaps in the future, as they had said, even if they really did achieve a born Taoism aptitude, they would no longer have any motivation to cultivate. With this thought in mind, the pity he felt for these living beings decreased greatly. Although he was not heartless, he had his own principles. He did not have confidence in himself and only believed from the beginning that they had no hope of succeeding on a normal path. He looked down on these creatures who had to rely on shortcuts to truly succeed. Although these creatures before him were braver than other creatures, and were even smarter and more flexible, as long as they had this kind of mentality, he did not have a good impression of them. As such, his intention to help them faded. Therefore, Luo Fan said coldly, Even so, I do not need slaves. However, you are all quite pitiful. Fine, I will point out a path for you. Whether you succeed or not will depend on yourselves. The 13 rulers were disappointed at first, but they were overjoyed when they heard Luo Fan's change in tone. They all said, Thank you for your mercy, great Immortal. Luo Fan had already made his decision. At this time, he didn't hesitate. He raised his hand and pointed. A ray of light rushed straight into the entrance of the passage he had come out from. It instantly spread down and reached the place where he had stayed for 3,000 years. After the ray of light reached that place, it suddenly reversed and spread downward. It reached the entrance of the tunnel again, but the entrance seemed to be blocked by some invisible barrier. It was forced to reverse again and go deeper into the tunnel. Just like that, the continuous cycle continued between the entrance and the bottom of the tunnel. It was endless, as if there would never be a moment when it would stop. During this process, the passageway gradually emitted a mysterious aura that attracted the gazes of all the kings present, making it impossible for them to shift their eyes away. To be continued. Chapter 758. I've set up some tests in this passageway. If you can make it to the end of this passageway, you'll naturally be able to cultivate a born Taoism aptitude. Luo Fan said plainly. As he spoke, he waved his hand. Ba Yuan immediately understood his thoughts and hurriedly used his magic to form a white cloud that lifted Luo Fan and himself up. It then drifted unhurriedly in a certain direction. The 13 kings seemed to have just woken up from a dream. They hurriedly kowtowed in the direction where Luo Fan had left, thanking Luo Fan for leaving such a supreme opportunity for them. In reality, Ba Yuan's flying speed was only average. If they wanted to chase after him, it would not be difficult at all. They could easily catch up to Luo Fan. However, they did not dare to chase after him. After all, Luo Fan had already said that he would not change his mind. If they chased after him, it would be disobeying Luo Fan's will. They naturally did not dare to do so. Secondly, they did not want to chase after him. The reason why they knelt there and begged Luo Fan to take them as slaves was so that they could obtain benefits and cultivate a born Taoism aptitude. Now that Luo Fan had left behind an opportunity to cultivate a born Taoism aptitude, and he did not need them to become slaves, was there anything better than this? How could they really be willing to chase after him and become his slaves? After Luo Fan and Ba Yuan disappeared from their sight, the 13 kings looked at each other and stood up. They began to discuss who would be the first to enter and take part in the test of the passageway. At this moment, the living beings on the mountain began to move. Almost all living beings who knew about the changes in this place began to gradually gather in this direction. They were not willing, and did not dare, to disturb Luo Fan. They begged Luo Fan. However, this did not mean that they did not look forward to cultivating a born Taoism aptitude. Even though this test was set up for the 13 kings, Luo Fan didn't say that other living beings couldn't enter, so they naturally wanted to try their luck. However, although the living beings on the mountain were not humans, they had their own relatively complete rules. Although almost all of the living beings were gathered here, none of the living beings dared to enter the passage before the 13 monarchs came out to take the test. The 13 kings discussed for a while, and although there were some arguments, they quickly decided that they would all be the kings of the same mountain. The strength of the contestants had already been determined by the public, so the order of entering and accepting the test was naturally determined according to their strength. The most powerful monarch had the appearance of a gorilla, but he had a pair of massive wings on his back, as well as a rather obvious tail. The proportions of the various parts of his body seemed a little awkward. He was already at the pinnacle of the second stage immortal realm. Breaking through was no longer a matter of power, but rather a matter of comprehension of the spiritual realm. He stood at the entrance of the passage and paused for a long time. Then, he gritted his teeth and dove into the passage. As he dove in, the eyes of the many living beings around the passage lit up. They locked onto the passage and his figure, clearly hoping to discover some secrets of the test from his encounter. This would make it easier for them to take the test themselves. However, they were disappointed in the end. After the monarch crashed into the passage flashed faintly and returned to normal. It was as if nothing had happened. The light did not change at all, and it was impossible to see what was happening inside the passage through the light. How could they tell that the monarch was taking the test? Inside the passage, the light was still shuttling back and forth between the bottom and the entrance, weaving endlessly. The light in the passage became denser and denser, and the structure of the light screen became more complex and complete. From the moment Luo Fan left until the first monarch entered, the complexity of the light screen had increased by several times. A few minutes after the monarch crashed into the passage, the complexity of the light screen had increased by several times. At this moment, the many living beings guarding outside also noticed the changes and knew that the test inside the passage would become more and more difficult as time passed. It would become more and more complicated and more difficult to pass. Under such circumstances, the other monarchs who could not wait for the strongest monarch to come out discussed among themselves and finally decided not to wait for the monarch to come out. Instead, they gathered together and entered the passage one by one, with intervals of 15 minutes between them. The passage itself was not very large, but it was rather deep and long. It extended from the mountainside all the way to the bottom. Soon, the 13 monarchs entered the passage, but it still did not cause any changes. It was as if nothing had happened and the 13 monarchs had never appeared. As the 13 monarchs entered, the living beings who came later waited for another 15 minutes. Finally, many living beings tried to enter the passage. In the end, it was obvious that they were like clay oxen entering the sea. They did not cause any changes to the passage, and the passage was the same as before. No living beings that had entered before came out. The creatures outside couldn't help but feel a sense of dread when they saw this. Was the passage really just a test? Would the living beings that entered really have a chance to come out? This kind of thought gradually appeared in the hearts of many living beings, and it eventually became the mainstream. With this mentality, the speed at which the living beings entered the passage gradually slowed down. In the end, after a few days, only some living beings stood guard outside. Not a single living being dared to enter the passage again to face an unpredictable fate. Among them was one of the 18 monarchs on the mountain. He was not the strongest among the 18 monarchs, nor was he the weakest. He was just the most ordinary, but he was also the most cautious. The monarch stayed by the side of the passage and paid attention to the changes. He did not stop the living beings from entering the passage, either. He waited quietly and cultivated quietly. Apart from a few of the more stubborn ones that still wanted to try their luck, most of the living beings in the surroundings gradually dispersed. After all, they had their own lives and their own cultivation. However, they could not keep wasting time here like these monarchs who could breathe clouds and spit mist. A few days later, this place had basically become the core of the mountain, which was over 3 million meters tall. At the same time, it could also be considered a forbidden ground. All the living beings' lives seemed to be focused on this place. Even the living beings that had left this place to cultivate elsewhere on the mountain were paying attention to the changes here. At this moment, the scene in the passage was completely different from the outside world. It was completely different from what all the living beings in the outside world imagined. At this moment, there was only a ray of light in the passage. It was still just a ray of light that continuously passed through and wove. The tens of millions of living beings that had entered, as well as the monarchs, had all disappeared without a trace. It was as if they had never stepped into the passage in the first place. It was as if they had vanished into thin air. If the living beings in the outside world saw this, they would probably think that the passage was a trap. They would think that Luo Fan was a schemer with ulterior motives, and they would no longer have any expectations for this place. It was even more impossible for there to be any living beings guarding the surroundings. The area within a few hundred kilometers would probably instantly become a forbidden ground, and no living beings would dare to step into this area. Of course, Luo Fan was not a schemer with ulterior motives. Rather, there was no need for him to plot against these living beings. At this moment, the situation in the passage was completely normal. This was the manifestation of Luo Fan's test. The ray of light that Luo Fan sent into the passage was extremely profound. It was formed from several dozen laws that he had refined from the great Tianyuan world. It was a rather profound ability that he had comprehended from the stone egg that was the origin of vitality below. The several dozen laws included some laws regarding time, space, illusion, truth, and falsehood. They interwove together according to some indescribable law. This resulted in some sort of unbelievable result. Due to this result, the ray of light had an unimaginable effect. This effect resulted in this wondrous scene. Although the living beings had entered the passage, they had completely disappeared, as if they had turned into nothingness. In reality, it was impossible for the living beings to disappear. They had merely entered the strange world woven by the ray of light. That strange world was not the real world, but something similar to an illusion. It was a world similar to a virtual world. This kind of world was very similar to the virtual game world of the future. However, it was more realistic, and its effects were even more unbelievable. The ray of light continuously shuttled back and forth between the bottom of the passage and the entrance. It was not just to maintain the light in the passage. Instead, it was to weave a world similar to a virtual world. It was precisely because of this that when this world was first formed, when the first king that entered the passage entered, there was only a silhouette. However, when the last living being entered, the world had already become an incredibly vast, complete, tight, and detailed world. This was also something that Luo Fan had deliberately set up. The earlier one entered the world, the cruder and more incomplete the world was. This meant that they would be able to see the truth of the world more clearly. From there, they would be able to break through the world and arrive at the true passage. When they reached the bottom, they would be able to complete Luo Fan's test. The later one entered the world, the more detailed, complete, and profound it would be. It would be more difficult to see through the truth of the world, and naturally, it would be more difficult to break through the world and arrive at the true passage. Therefore, the more courageous and powerful a living being was, the more likely they would be to complete the test. Of course, although this kind of advantage existed, it was not too obvious. If the living beings that entered first could not see through the truth of the world and break through as soon as possible, then as time passed, the world would become more complete and complicated. As a result, it would be more difficult to break through, and they would not be able to maintain their advantage for long. The world that Luo Fan weaved was weaved based on his impression of the Great Tianyuan world. It was a miniature version of the Great Tianyuan world. Of course, everything in it was weaved according to the standards of the primordial world. For example, its size and the stability of its spacetime were all the standards of the primordial world. Even so, the world was already unimaginably vast. If these living beings could not see through the truth immediately, it would be more and more difficult for them to break through the world in the future. In the end, they would even have to obtain an unbelievable breakthrough. Only when they reached the 4th, 5th, 6th, or even 7th stage could they truly break through the world. When that time came, they would naturally no longer need the benefits that Luo Fan had given them. They would no longer need the opportunity at the bottom of the tunnel to obtain a Khanate Dao body. Of course, Luo Fan had indeed left some power at the bottom of the tunnel that could allow them to obtain a Khanate Dao body. However, that was just a precaution. Based on his understanding of the many living beings, it was almost impossible for them to break through the world before they needed to use this power to obtain a Khanate Dao body. As the living beings entered, the virtual world became more and more lively. Gradually, it evolved into a different kind of Great Tianyuan world. Although the king that entered first could not break through the world, he managed to peek into many of the mysteries of the world's structure when the world was still incomplete. From then on, he obtained various great divine abilities and great abilities in the world, becoming a mighty figure of the world. From then on, he gradually began to occupy the highest position in the world. He began to divide the world, leading the many virtual living beings and real living beings. Among them, countless grudges were born. In the end, they gradually forgot everything about the outside world. They had gradually forgotten everything about the outside world. They had forgotten that they had come to this world to accept the test. They had forgotten their initial goal. They only knew how to pursue the virtual benefits in this world, and they no longer had any thoughts of leaving this world. Everything was just as Luo Fan had expected. As they continuously poured into the tunnel to accept the test, Luo Fan and Ba Yuan had already arrived outside Longchuan City. It was Ba Yuan's first time being a slave. Although he tried his best to do what he knew about being a slave, hearing it and doing it were not the same. Hence, he had been holding it in for a long time. However, when they arrived outside Longchuan City, he could not help but ask, "Master, Ba Yuan has a question that is difficult to solve. I wonder if you can give me some guidance?" Luo Fan could tell that Ba Yuan had been holding it in for a long time. Seeing that Ba Yuan had finally asked after they arrived, Luo Fan smiled and did not mind. He said, "What is it? Ask away." During this process, he carefully observed the nearby Longchuan City. Longchuan City was incomparably vast. It occupied an area with a radius of 20,000 to 30,000 miles. Such vastness was nothing in the untainted world. However, it was unimaginably vast in the earth of his previous life. Of course, Luo Fan's knowledge was billions of times greater than that of his time on Earth. He was not too shocked by this. However, when he thought that Longchuan City was only a rank 2 city, even in the Matian Sanctuary, it could not even be ranked in the top 10 million. He could not help but sigh. It was only a rank 2 city that was not ranked in the top 10 million. How large would the rank 8 and 9 cities be? How prosperous would the great Tianyuan world be? He raised his eyes and scanned the area. With a slight release of his perception, he discovered that the city was not simply large. There were hundreds of millions of creatures living in it. Almost at every moment, there was a powerful force erupting in the city. Rays of brilliance were shuttling through the city at all times. The hundreds of millions of auras were intertwined in one place, like the bright moon in the darkness. It was extremely conspicuous, allowing Luo Fan to feel the rich human presence in it from afar. The human presence was even denser than in his Wuji palace. He could not help but pay attention to it. Ba Yuan saw that Master didn't seem to like them, so why did he leave that opportunity for them so that they could take the shortcut? Hearing Luo Fan's approval, Ba Yuan hurriedly asked the question that he had been suppressing all this time. When Luo Fan heard the question, he chuckled and said, "That is not just a shortcut. It is actually a fork in the road. If their mentality can break through, they will naturally be able to easily pass the test and obtain the opportunity. But if their mentality remains the same, it will be a long and winding road. Although they can reach the highest realm in the end, they will have to take a long detour. Whether they succeed or not will depend on themselves." Although he didn't directly answer Ba Yuan's question, Ba Yuan instantly understood what he meant when he heard his words. He couldn't help but reveal an indescribably complicated expression. There was a sudden realization, shock, and fear in his expression, but he could not calm down at all. His realization was naturally because he had obtained the answer to his doubts. He knew that the opportunity that Luo Fan gave them was extremely dangerous. With the mentality of his former companions and opponents, it was impossible for them to succeed as they thought. They were almost 100% bound to fail. They were 100% bound to take the long and winding road. Therefore, the opportunity that Luo Fan had given them was absolutely something that could only be given to them by someone who looked down on them. What shocked him was that Luo Fan had set up such an exquisite trap without saying a word. This was something that he had never imagined in the past tens of millions of years. Naturally, he was shocked. As for fear, it was naturally because Luo Fan's mentality was so indifferent. He had set up such a trap just because it was convenient for him. He himself would be a slave to such an existence for 3,000 years. If he was not careful, he might not even know how he died. How could he not be afraid? As his expression changed, Ba Yuan suddenly regretted asking Luo Fan this question. I wonder if Master will be dissatisfied with me for talking too much and make some arrangements similar to that opportunity for me. This thought suddenly appeared in Ba Yuan's mind. Cold sweat instantly dripped down his back. To be continued. Chapter 759. Luo Fan naturally knew what Ba Yuan was thinking, but he didn't care. He just said, "Let's enter the city." This chapter has been updated by a netizen as he spoke. He walked unhurriedly toward Longchuan City. Longchuan City was not a city in the mortal world, and the Great Tianyuan world was not the Earth from Luo Fan's previous life. Therefore, Longchuan City existed in a very different form from the cities on Earth. Longchuan City didn't have any city walls, nor did it have any city guards. It didn't even have a specific dividing line between the city and the city. There was only a rather majestic building that served as the entrance to the city. Luo Fan and Ba Yuan arrived at the entrance of the city unhurriedly. They saw a few creatures dressed in official robes inside the building. When the two of them passed by, they didn't ask them anything. They just glanced at them casually, then lowered their heads and continued with their own business. The creatures inside the building all had connate Taoist aptitude. However, that didn't mean that all of them were immortals. They didn't have higher cultivation than Ba Yuan, nor did they have more powerful magic powers. In fact, it was the opposite. Most of these creatures were only at the 4th or 5th stage of the mortal realm. They were naturally much stronger than ordinary creatures, but compared to cultivators and Ba Yuan, they were many times weaker. The reason why they had connate Taoist aptitudes was because they were born with such connate Taoist aptitude. They were the protagonists of the Great Tianyuan world, the humans of the Great Tianyuan world. From inside the building, these people could see anyone who entered Longchuan City from the main road. Clearly, they were the ones guarding and inspecting the various creatures that entered Longchuan City. As for how they, who were only at the 4th or 5th stage of the mortal realm, could inspect and intimidate the creatures that entered Longchuan City, it was because, although they were weak, they could use the power of Longchuan City to unleash unimaginable power. Even a first-stage immortal would be subdued by them. Of course, he was just a first-stage immortal. Although Longchuan City was a behemoth to immortals, and the power it possessed were so strong that ordinary immortals couldn't resist it, it was still a foreign object to these 4th or 5th stage mortal realm existences. Moreover, their realms were not high enough. No matter how strong their power was, they could only unleash a portion of it. It was already incredible that they could subdue a first-stage immortal. However, this was enough. Second-stage immortals were equivalent to perfected immortals. They were tens of thousands of times more powerful than first-stage immortals, who were equivalent to itinerant immortals. Compared to a second-stage immortal, a second-stage immortal was already a rather powerful existence. If such an existence wanted to break through, it would at least require an immortal of the same level to stop him. Naturally, a second-stage immortal would not guard a second-stage immortal like this. Hence, no one expected them to be able to stop a second-stage immortal. Luo Fan and Ba Yuan leisurely stepped into the building. As they moved forward, the number of buildings around them increased, and the number of people became more and more prosperous. Any city, even if it was a city in the cultivation world, or even a city in the Great Tianyuan world, would inevitably have all sorts of professions, just like a city in the mortal world. Hence, there were naturally many hawkers and shops that were similar to those in the mortal world. However, the essence of a cultivation city was much higher than that of a small city in the mortal world. Hence, although there were hawkers and shops everywhere, some of the details revealed the essence of cultivation. Many scenes that were inconceivable in the mortal world could be seen everywhere in this small city, making Longchuan City look like a city of fantasy. Although Luo Fan had seen countless cities that were far beyond the mortal world in his infinite void palace, this was the Great Tianyuan world after all, not his infinite void palace. This Longchuan City naturally had a completely different characteristic from the cities in his infinite void palace. However, he was very interested in it and found it very interesting. Luo Fan found it interesting, so naturally Ba Yuan, who was a native cultivator of a different race, couldn't even blink his eyes when he saw this. The last time he saw Longchuan City was hundreds of thousands of years ago. At that time, he could only look at it from afar and did not dare to enter the vicinity of Longchuan City. He was afraid that he would be discovered by the powerful creatures in the city and be captured by them. Now, after hundreds of thousands of years, he was seeing Longchuan City again. Moreover, he was seeing it in such a direct way. Naturally, he felt that his horizons had been broadened. The various novel sights of civilization shocked him greatly, and he felt that his eyes were not enough to take in everything. As Luo Fan watched, thoughts flashed through his mind as he sensed all sorts of things in Longchuan City. There were hundreds of millions of creatures in Longchuan City. Among them, the most powerful creature was a third-stage immortal. Although he had just stepped into the third stage, he was enough to suppress a level 2 city. Looking at his location, which was close to the center of the city, the third-stage immortal must be of the same status as the city lord. A third-stage immortal was only equivalent to the golden celestial realm. Compared to a disbanded celestial of the great all-embracing heaven like Luo Fan, he was tens of thousands of times weaker. If Luo Fan wanted to, he could casually crush that third-stage immortal. However, he would not do so. Although he had come to the great Tianyuan world to accept challenges, to see a wider world, and to see the divine power of a sage in order to have a hope of breaking through, it did not mean that he had to provoke a sage and seek his own death. Although the strength of the third-stage immortal in Longchuan City seemed so weak that he could crush thousands of them with one hand, he had the skyscraping sage behind him. Even if his status was extremely low and he did not have a close relationship with the skyscraping sage, they were still connected. Although he had heard countless things about the great Tianyuan world, he was, after all, very unfamiliar. He had no way of knowing whether or not he would cause an overreaction from the skyscraping sage if he killed this third-stage immortal. Under such circumstances, he naturally would not think that he could easily control that third-stage immortal and do whatever he wanted in Longchuan City. With a thought, Luo Fan said to Ba Yuan, "Go find someone and ask where the largest inn in Longchuan City is." Ba Yuan hurriedly responded to Luo Fan's instructions and walked to the side to ask a roadside vendor. Although it was also his first time in Longchuan City and he could not find the way to the largest inn, as a servant, he was naturally the only one who could ask for directions. Soon, Ba Yuan found the way and came back to report. "So it is Longchuan Restaurant. Since it dares to have such a name, it must be quite big." Luo Fan listened to Ba Yuan's reply and smiled slightly. "Master, you may not know this, but Longchuan Restaurant was built at the same time as Longchuan City. It has a history of tens of millions of years. It can be said to be the landmark of Longchuan City." Ba Yuan told him everything he knew without holding back. Luo Fan nodded and walked towards Longchuan Restaurant with Ba Yuan. This Longchuan City was not Luo Fan's final destination, nor was it a place where he planned to settle down. However, since he was here, he naturally wanted to experience life in Longchuan City. If he just passed by, how could he achieve his goal of coming to the great Tianyuan world? In reality, Longchuan Restaurant was very eye-catching in Longchuan City. It was practically the tallest and largest building in Longchuan City. It also emitted a strange aura that fused with Longchuan City, yet it was somewhat independent. It was extremely strange and mysterious. Even if one did not see the building, one could faintly feel that there was something special there. Driven by this feeling, not to mention Luo Fan, even Ba Yuan walked in a straight line and arrived at Longchuan Restaurant without any detours. The huge building, which was as tall as the clouds and covered an area of several dozen miles, occupied a position near the southeast of Longchuan City. Although it was not the center of Longchuan City, it was the most prosperous place in the city. At this position, the surroundings were a boiling cauldron of voices. There were many worldly realm living beings. Although they were not rubbing shoulders with one another, it was still extremely lively. Standing at the entrance of Longchuan Restaurant, Luo Fan could not help but sigh in admiration when he raised his head and looked. Although Longchuan Restaurant was huge, it did not give off any pressure. Instead, it was extremely peaceful, almost like a real home. It gave off a sense of familiarity. At the entrance, there were a few servants who were constantly greeting the passing guests. They seemed attentive and friendly, making people feel at home. At this moment, Luo Fan truly believed that Longchuan Restaurant was indeed built at the same time as Longchuan City. This was because the signboard of Longchuan Restaurant had a history of tens of millions of years. The vicissitudes of life and the aura of time on it could be clearly sensed by ordinary living beings, let alone a powerful existence like Luo Fan. Of course, only this plaque could tell that it had existed for such a long period of time. Looking at the other building materials other than the plaque, it was extremely rare to see materials that were more than 10,000 years old. Some of them were even built within a few decades. Clearly, Longchuan Restaurant had been continuously damaged and repaired under the corrosion of time. That was why such a strange thing had happened. Seeing that Luo Fan was standing there for a while, the servant at the entrance came up to greet him and asked, "Sir, are you looking for a place to stay? Our Longchuan Restaurant is the largest inn in Longchuan City. Our service is definitely the best. If you are looking for a place to stay, Longchuan Restaurant is definitely your best choice." This greeting was friendly and sincere, making people naturally have a good impression of him. Even if they did not want to stay, they would probably feel embarrassed to reject him. Luo Fan smiled and said, "I came here because I heard that Longchuan Restaurant is so outstanding. Sir, you are indeed a good person. Please come in." The servant was overjoyed and hurriedly called out. This manservant was only at the third rank of the mortal realm. Even though he was at 8th yuan, he was still tens of thousands of times stronger than him. This kind of difference in strength was enough to form a pressure on the origin of life, causing the manservant to feel a great pressure at all times. However, even so, this servant still appeared calm and at ease. There was no change in his expression because of the huge gap in strength between them. It was as if Luo Fan and Ba Yuan, who were standing in front of him, were just two ordinary guests. This calmness was clearly not due to the determination of this little waiter. Instead, it was due to the foundation of the Dragon River Manor. This was because this little waiter had a powerful backer behind him. This backer was sufficient to support him in the face of a power that he could not resist. Naturally, he would not feel the slightest bit inferior to the other party. In this way, he naturally did not feel too much pressure and was able to maintain his calm. After entering the main hall, the interior was no different from the restaurants in the mortal world. It was still a place to eat and drink, but this place was even more mysterious. Light flickered and mysterious techniques shuttled through the void. There were even various space-time techniques that opened up an even wider void in the originally spacious main hall, allowing the living beings eating and drinking to have an independent space. Although there were many living beings in the main hall, they did not affect each other and were enjoying themselves. The manservant led Luo Fan to the end of the lobby. There was a counter there, and an old man sat behind it. He was holding a strange iron pen in his hand and was constantly drawing on a magic tool that was shaped like an iron plate. Every time he drew, a strange light mark would appear on the surface of the magic tool. The mark was deeply engraved into the magic tool and stored. "Shopkeeper, this guest would like to stay in the inn. Please make the arrangements," the servant said respectfully. When the old man heard this, he hurriedly put down the iron pen and iron board. He smiled and said, "Thank you for choosing our Longchuan Restaurant. I believe that you will not regret your choice." He did not seem to be arrogant at all. It was as if he was dealing with an ordinary guest in an ordinary restaurant. Luo Fan could not help but sigh, Any store that can exist for such a long time definitely has something extraordinary about it. Shopkeeper, us master and servant are already a little tired. Do you still have a superior residence here? Luo Fan didn't open his mouth, but Ba Yuan tactfully came up and asked. The shopkeeper chuckled and said, "You've come at the right time. I happen to have a superior lodging available. If you had come a few days earlier or a few days later, I'm afraid I would have disappointed you." Ba Yuan smiled and began to negotiate with the shopkeeper. After a while, they finally decided on the price and service. The cultivation civilization of the great heaven primordial world had developed to an unimaginable extreme. The currency used in this world was naturally not the silver coins of the mortal world, and it was even more impossible for it to be crystals and spirit stones. In reality, the silver coins used in the great heaven primordial world were magical techniques condensed by cultivators. In the cultivation of the great heaven primordial world, apart from the fundamental techniques used to increase one's cultivation, there were also various magical techniques used to refine devils for self-defense. Among them, the fundamental techniques used to increase one's cultivation were the foundation of a cultivator's progress. They were the hope for a cultivator to transcend, so they naturally could not be traded. But the magical techniques were different. That technique was like a cultivator's weapon. Although it took energy, spirit, and time to condense it, it would not harm the cultivator's cultivation after it was lost, and it would not help the cultivator's cultivation after obtaining it. That was why it could be used to trade. As for trading methods, it was even simpler. The great heaven primordial world had an unknown number of trillions of years of cultivation history. The cultivation civilization had developed to the point where there were no less than 800 sages. How could there not be a way to condense the magical techniques of a cultivator and use them as currency? There were many benefits to this type of currency system. Cultivators who obtained the objects materialized from the spell techniques could use them to buy and sell living creatures. They could also use the currency to directly unleash the spell techniques to defend themselves and kill enemies. At the same time, this method was also a way to protect the resources of the great heaven primordial world. After all, magical techniques were condensed by the cultivator themselves. The consumption of resources from the outside world was much less than directly using resources as currency. Although the difference between the two wasn't that great in the long run, the difference between the two would accumulate to an unimaginable degree. For a currency system, the various rules were naturally very strict and precise. Which magical technique corresponded to which value was strictly regulated. Because of this, there was no need for all kinds of magical techniques to be unified. Any cultivator only needed to condense the magical techniques they cultivated, and they could directly turn them into currency. Of course, for creatures of different levels, the value of the same magical technique differed. For example, if Tian Yuan exchanged with a second-rank immortal, he wouldn't be able to condense a mortal realm magical technique. He would have to condense an immortal realm magical technique in order to have some value in exchange with other second-rank immortals. But at this moment, although the shopkeeper in front of Tian Yuan had reached the 9th rank of the mortal realm and wasn't weak, he was still in the mortal realm. Naturally, the magical techniques he collected were also mortal realm magical technique. For an 8th origin stage cultivator, he could form thousands of worldly realm magical spells with just a few thoughts. Under these circumstances, Luo Fan and Ba Yuan naturally didn't need to worry about not having enough money to pay the bill. After handing over the magical techniques, someone led Luo Fan and Ba Yuan to the lobby and upstairs. This Longchuan restaurant was an inn in the great heaven primordial world and was very different from the mortal realm inn. Once they went upstairs, they didn't see rows of pigeon cages. Instead, they saw pieces of illusory worlds. These illusory worlds were arranged one after another, in a circle, in a row, all the way to the top of the building. Each illusory world was different and had its own style. The space inside them wasn't very wide, only several 100,000 feet at most. However, they were very lively and looked just like the real thing at first glance. The manservant led Luo Fan and Ba Yuan through the illusory world after illusory world, continuously going up. Soon, they arrived at a dozen floors above the illusory world and arrived at the entrance of an illusory world that was 10 floors above the top of the Longchuan building. This is the only high-class residence left. Please feel free to do as you please. If you have any instructions, you can send them to the iron plate in the illusory world, and someone will come to serve you. The manservant opened the entrance to the illusory world and said to Luo Fan and Ba Yuan. Luo Fan was fine. Although he was a little surprised that the Longchuan restaurant was using this method to accommodate guests, he didn't find it too unbelievable. Ba Yuan, on the other hand, was already dumbstruck. He was practically numb as he was led here. Chapter 760. Although Ba Yuan had lived for tens of millions of years and had seen a lot, he mostly lived on the mountain peak that was more than 3 million feet tall. Even if he left occasionally, he would go to other deep mountains and forests to search for heavenly materials and earthly treasures. He had heard of Longchuan City and even seen it from the outside, but he had never entered it before. He had never truly understood what the inns inside Longchuan City looked like. Therefore, it was the first time he had seen such an illusory world used as an inn's residence. For a moment, he felt as if he had come to a whole world, a whole heaven and earth, and witnessed some scenes that were different from what he knew in the past. The impact that completely overturned his past knowledge was unparalleled to him. Just now, he was so dumbfounded that he was almost lifeless. I didn't expect that the combination of a few incantations would be able to construct such an illusory world. Could it be that I lived for tens of millions of years in the past for nothing? After the servant left, Ba Yuan finally came back to his senses. Such a thought flashed through his mind, and for a moment, he looked a little dispirited. These illusory worlds barely reached the first stage of the immortal realm. For Ba Yuan, a second stage immortal, there were not many secrets in them. With a glance, he could roughly tell which incantations were used to construct them. Of course, it was only a rough idea. The subtleties were naturally shielded and would not be known by outsiders. However, even if they were shielded, it was only the construction method of the incantations. There were no more powerful incantations in them. Therefore, Ba Yuan completely understood which incantations were used to construct these numerous illusory worlds and create these various residences. It was precisely because he could see clearly that he became even more dispirited and suffered a blow. The same incantation in his hands could only be thrown out like a stone to smash people, but in Longchuan manner, it could be carved into countless parts to construct powerful machinery that could destroy the world. This difference in awareness made him dispirited. Luo Fan naturally would not pay attention to Ba Yuan at all times. After all, Ba Yuan was only his servant. After the servant left, he directly passed through the illusory world's door and entered that world. From the surface, the world seemed to be lumps of light that seemed to have substance. One could only see the characteristics of the world inside through the changes of the light. However, after entering, what he saw was no longer that brilliance. Instead, it was a world that seemed extremely complete, filled with endless mysteries, and was almost boundless. This boundless world seemed to be even vaster than the great Tianyuan world. Looking into the distance, even the farthest places seemed to be incomparably detailed. If it was a mortal, they would probably think that they had come to another real world. But Luo Fan and Ba Yuan would naturally not be like that. Both of them saw through the truth of this illusory world with a single glance. They knew that this was actually a square space with a circumference of hundreds of thousands of feet. Apart from the various things within this area, everything else was just light and shadows, just an illusion. If they went past this area, they would probably be smashed into pieces and bleed from the impact. Luo Fan raised his hand and beckoned to Ba Yuan. Ba Yuan's key flew into his hand. He lifted his hand and pointed. The key emitted a ray of light that resonated with the illusory world. Then, a screen of light descended from the sky between the illusory world and revealed another light image. It was a light image that was completely different from the one in the illusory world. It was the various scenes outside Longchuan restaurant. With a turn of his hand, the light image kept changing. It enlarged and shrank, rotated and lingered, zoomed in and out, and revealed the various scenes within Longchuan City. This is the window. Luo Fan's heart stirred and he understood this point. With a turn of his hand, Luo Fan kept the key and threw it to Ba Yuan. Then, he walked to a manor with a courtyard in the center of the world. There was naturally everything that one needed. Just by relying on the various things here, it was enough to completely satisfy the needs of an individual's cultivation. In fact, even if there were tens or hundreds of people living here, it would not be too cramped. The fee for this illusory world was calculated in months. Therefore, Luo Fan and Ba Yuan had to stay in this illusory world for at least a month before they considered the issue of renewal fees. This illusory world had everything, including all kinds of materials that were necessary for cultivation. However, for Luo Fan, he would not stay in this illusory world obediently. After enjoying the feeling of staying in an inn in the great Tianyuan world represented by the illusory world for a day, Luo Fan left Longchuan restaurant with Tianyuan and began to wander around Longchuan City. He could cover the entire Longchuan City with his perception and see everything clearly. However, that did not mean much to him. Therefore, he did not just use his perception to observe Longchuan City. Instead, he used his feet to bring himself to various parts of Longchuan City. He used his own eyes to carefully observe the various sights of the city. These sights were not strange to the residents of Longchuan City. They just felt that this kind of life was convenient and the sights were impressive, but they did not pay too much attention to it. However, for Luo Fan, who had come from the untainted land, almost every place displayed the civilization of the great Tianyuan world in a certain way. It displayed the long history of the great Tianyuan world, as well as the current situation and development of the cultivation world of the great Tianyuan world. Combined with the various things he had heard from the venerable human, Luo Fan's understanding of the great Tianyuan world had deepened several times over the past few days. He had also vaguely grasped the context of the current social situation of the great Tianyuan world. The great Tianyuan world was a great world. It was a perfect world like the untainted land that had undergone 9 great tribulations. It was a great world that had transformed and sublimated. This kind of world could accommodate countless sages cultivating in it and nurture countless cultivators to grow in it. In such a world, the number of sages no longer meant anything. Whether there were more or less sages, it made no difference to this vast world. For those sages, there was no essential conflict between them and the sages. Under this premise, the atmosphere of the great Tianyuan world was completely different from that of the untainted land in myths and legends. The sages of this great world no longer suppressed the cultivators who had the potential to become sages. Instead, they created countless conditions to help the cultivators who had the potential to become sages. In the entire great world, the atmosphere of cultivation was extremely rich. In the eyes of all living beings, the existence of the sages was not like the great thieves of the untainted land in myths and legends. There was no such saying as long as the sages are not dead, the great thieves will not stop. The sages were more like supreme, noble, and powerful pioneers who had transcended heaven and earth and everything else. This mentality was completely integrated into all the civilization of the great Tianyuan world. It was displayed to all living beings without concealment, showing the huge difference between the sages and Luo Fan who had come from the untainted land. However, even though Luo Fan understood that the existence of the sages would not suppress the cultivators who had the chance to become sages and would instead create conditions for such cultivators to break through, Luo Fan was not naive enough to believe that any sages would be so kind to a cultivator who had the chance to become sages. There were 800 sages in the great Tianyuan world, not just one or two. 800 sages were enough to form a rather large Jianghu. Luo Fan did not believe that there were really no conflicts between the sages. Since there were conflicts, the sages would naturally have a standpoint, and the standpoint of the sages would naturally require other cultivators to have a standpoint as well. Therefore, a cultivator who had the chance to become a sage would most likely be protected by a sage from one camp, but at the same time, he would be ostracized or roped in by other camps. As for Luo Fan, putting aside the possibility of him becoming a sage in the eyes of the sages, he had appeared out of thin air and did not have much connection with any place in the great Tianyuan world. Therefore, it was clear that there were almost no sages who could protect him. Under such circumstances, how could Luo Fan feel that the cultivation atmosphere in this world was so good that he would definitely be favored and protected by the Matian sage? Therefore, after strolling around Longchuan City for a few days, Luo Fan finally decided to leave Longchuan City, leave this continent, and leave the Matian Holy Region. Above the Matian Holy Region and any other holy region, there was a figure that could cover the sky and cover all light and nutrients. It was the figure of a sage. Because of the existence of this figure, Luo Fan's actions were restrained and he could not really get rid of it. Moreover, because of the existence of the figure of the sage, the battles in the holy region were somewhat scrupulous. Compared to normal battles, there were much fewer battles. However, the tens of thousands of continents outside the 800 holy regions were completely different from the inner holy regions. If the sages wanted to, they could also cover those continents. However, according to the ancient unspoken rule, the 800 sages did not cover the outer holy region with their divine power. Instead, they left the wilderness in the outer holy region to the many cultivators who had not become sages and to the sages who would become sages in the future. Of course, this was not because the sages were noble and pure. It was because the tens of thousands of continents in their own holy region were more than enough for them to manage for endless years. After all, the area of a continent was smaller than the entire untainted land before the great tribulation of heaven and earth, but it was still an existence of the same level. Such tens of thousands of continents were equivalent to thousands of untainted land. For a sage, this was enough to manage. Because of these reasons, Luo Fan quickly made a decision. On this day, Luo Fan ordered Ba Yuan to check out the superior residence of Longchuan Restaurant. Then, he went to the exit of Longchuan City with Ba Yuan. Every continent in the great Tianyuan world was vast and boundless. It was naturally easy for a sage to travel across continents. However, it was not so easy for a non-sage existence to travel to another continent. Even a stage 8 or 8 immortal would probably have to spend hundreds of years to cross the distance between two continents. For a stage 4 or 5 immortal, it would take tens of thousands of years to cross the distance between two continents. For a stage 1 or 2 immortal, it was almost impossible for a stage 2 or 3 immortal to cross this distance on their own, let alone a creature in the mortal realm. This background had lasted for trillions of years. Naturally, there were countless solutions. Flying and escaping vehicles were naturally the most common solution. However, the most convenient solution was the Void Gate, a strange gate that could connect two extremely distant places in the great Tianyuan world. This kind of void gate required endless energy and could only be set up by an infinitely powerful being like a sage. Once the void gate was set up, the natural moat would become a passageway. The distance of trillions of miles would become invisible and would no longer be an obstacle to travel. It was precisely because of the existence of the void gate that the tens of thousands of continents, which were not much smaller than the entire untainted land, could merge into one. They would not be separated by too great a distance. Longchuan City, where Luo Fan was currently, was only a small Stage 2 city. However, because it was located at the edge of the Matian holy region, it had the important responsibility of communicating with the outer world. Therefore, there was a void gate system. That void gate system was the exit of the border where Luo Fan was currently. The exit was not a building. Instead, it was a plaza in the center of Longchuan City near the city lord's mansion. There were hundreds of bronze gates that were dozens of feet tall and emitted powerful auras. They were arranged according to a strange pattern. Around these gates, there were several armored soldiers standing guard by the side with various weapons that emitted powerful ripples. The flat ground of the plaza was engraved with countless strange meandering lines that connected the hundreds of gates together in a strange manner. The auras between them resonated with each other. The light emitted by the gates rose and fell, appearing extremely mysterious and complicated. At this moment, the plaza was extremely busy. Other than a few gates, there were many living beings continuously entering and exiting the gate. Everyone who entered and exited the gates would be questioned by the surrounding armored soldiers. A thought flashed through Luo Fan's mind. He knew that his target should not be the gates that were filled with tourists. Instead, it should be the few gates that did not have many people entering and exiting. The reason was very simple. Although he had never been to the outer world, from what the sovereign had said and what he had deduced, the outer world was definitely a more chaotic place than the inner world. Obviously, other than living beings with lofty aspirations, not many living beings would be willing to go from a peaceful place to a chaotic place. Luo Fan sent Ba Yuan to inquire about the location of the nearest void gate to the outer world. Ba Yuan accepted the order and left. After a while, he returned to report. Indeed, it pointed to a void gate that not many people entered and exited. Luo Fan nodded and brought Ba Yuan towards the void gate. When he arrived in front of the void gate, a middle-aged soldier greeted him and asked, "This is the void gate that leads to the outer world, the southern barbarians. If you are not going to the southern barbarians, there is no need to come here." Luo Fan smiled and said, "We are officially going to the outer world." The middle-aged soldier was a first-rank immortal. His strength was more than 100 times stronger than the soldiers around him. However, he could barely sense the vast and endless power on Ba Yuan's body. After asking a question, he no longer tried to persuade Luo Fan. He said, "The path to the southern barbarians in the outer world is a cross-domain road. It requires 3,000 first-rank immortal techniques or 3 first-rank immortal techniques. Only 10 people can pass each time. Immortal techniques were immortal realm technique. If one had not reached the immortal realm, the techniques condensed would only be mortal technique. Even if it was a peak-level 9th-rank mortal technique, it was still a mortal technique. Its value was 1,000 times lower than a first-rank immortal technique." Luo Fan smiled slightly. Ba Yuan, who was gradually getting familiar with how to be a slave, came forward. He casually took out 3 objects that emitted a faint brilliance. They were 1 inch in diameter and looked like coins. They were engraved with countless complicated and mysterious patterns. He took them out and handed them to the middle-aged soldier. These were the currency condensed by the technique. These 3 techniques were all cultivated by Ba Yuan. They were a kind of fire technique. If they were activated, they would be able to release a blazing white fire dragon that could melt mountains and scorch the seas. When the middle-aged soldier saw that Ba Yuan had casually taken out such a powerful fire technique, he could not help but be shocked. His expression became very respectful. He carefully took the 3 fire techniques and led Luo Fan and Ba Yuan to the void gate. He raised his hand and pressed on the void gate. The void gate buzzed and began to gradually light up. The countless patterns engraved on the entire square began to light up. It was as if many spiritual snakes were swimming on the square in an instant. After the light swam a few times, it condensed into the void gate where Luo Fan and Ba Yuan were. Then, the space-time inside the void gate gradually distorted. It was as if in an instant, there was endless space-time flowing through the void gate. After a while, the space-time inside the void gate finally stabilized, leaving only a strange light screen that covered the void gate. Please pass. As long as you pass through this gate, you will be in the southern barbarians of the outer domain, the middle-aged soldier said respectfully. Luo Fan smiled slightly and nodded. Without hesitation, he stepped into the light screen. Ba Yuan did not dare to be negligent and followed closely behind. The moment he crashed into the light screen, a feeling of traveling through space-time suddenly emerged in Luo Fan's mind. It was as if he had not only crossed a few feet, but had crossed billions of miles. Luo Fan's body in this world had the cultivation of a disbanded celestial of the great all-embracing heaven. His spirit and willpower had almost reached the peak of the true path of the great all-embracing heaven. Under such circumstances, his perception had reached an unimaginable level. In just a split second, he could sense that there were countless rules and laws twisting around his body, creating a magical effect of distorting space and time, sending his body across space and time to an unfathomable place. In an instant, all these changes disappeared. Luo Fan came back to his senses from that mysterious perception and found that he was no longer in Longchuan City. Instead, he was in a completely unfamiliar place. He had traveled through the endless void and arrived in the southern barbarians of the outer domain, a place that he was completely unfamiliar with. Ba Yuan followed closely behind him. At most a breath's time, he also came out of the void gate. Hey, there are actually 2 more fools coming out of the inner domain. At this time, a playful voice came from the side. Baidu Search Bubble Book Reading. Chapter 761. Luo Fan didn't feel anything when he heard the voice, but Ba Yuan was enraged. He released the power in his body, and the powerful aura of a rank 2 immortal shot up into the sky. It covered the sky and the earth as it pressed down on the source of the voice. It was so merciless that it seemed as if it wanted to crush the person who spoke. Text first. This isn't the inner area. You're far from being able to show off here. The person who spoke was a young man who emitted an endless murderous aura. His entire body was filled with killing intent, and a bloody aura surged around him. The young man was only a rank 1 immortal, but he wasn't afraid of the powerful aura of a rank 2 immortal like Ba Yuan. There was only deep disdain on his face. His body shook, and a blood-red light shot out from the back of his head, carrying endless killing intent as it met Ba Yuan's aura. There was a loud rumble as the blood-red light and the aura collided, producing an earth-shattering sound. The surrounding acquired origin energy of heaven and earth exploded in all directions. It was as if a huge bomb had exploded there in that instant, creating a gust of wind that caused the surrounding people to squint their eyes. After the gust of wind subsided, everything calmed down. Whether it was Ba Yuan or that person, neither of them seemed to be in a sorry state. The clash of auras between a second-stage immortal and a first-stage immortal was actually evenly matched. Neither of them was able to suppress the other. Ba Yuan couldn't help but narrow his eyes when he saw this. An indescribable shock welled up in his heart. This person isn't strong, but he's experienced countless life and death situations. He's honed an undying fighting spirit. He's actually able to unleash an aura that exceeds his own level and is on par with me. Is this the outer area? This was the only thought in Ba Yuan's mind. Luo Fan's eyes couldn't help but light up when he saw all of this. He had even more expectations for the outer realm. They were currently in a public square, but this public square was more than 10 times smaller than the one in Longchuan City. There were hundreds of void gates in the square in Longchuan City, but there were only 13 void gates in this square. The area in front of the 13 void gates was also quite lively. However, it was far from comparable to the void gate in Longchuan City. However, the auras emitted by those who entered and exited the void gate were rather powerful. First-stage immortals were everywhere, second-stage immortals could occasionally be seen, and third-stage immortals could be seen every once in a while. All of this, compared to Longchuan City, it was many times stronger. Outside the square, there were buildings that were mostly intact, but many traces of repair could be seen. Even those paths appeared to be extremely dilapidated. It was very old. Just by looking at it, one could naturally sense a tragic aura of having gone through hundreds of battles. The entire world was filled with a wild, desolate, bloody, and ancient aura. While the young man was ridiculing Luo Fan and Ba Yuan, the passers-by only occasionally glanced at them with interest but did not think it was a big deal. Only when their auras clashed against each other did more living beings cast their gazes over. Their gazes seemed to have changed a little. However, this change was not directed at the young man, but at Luo Fan and Ba Yuan. It was as if they felt that it was incredible that Ba Yuan, a second-stage immortal, could match the young man, who was a first-stage immortal. Luo Fan raised his eyes and glanced around, seeing through everyone's mentality. For a moment, he was filled with emotions. Although it was only a small area. Just from this, one could see the huge difference between the southern wilderness and Longchuan City. Compared to this place, Longchuan City was more like a greenhouse that could not be eroded by the wind and rain of the outside world. On the other hand, the outer region was like cruel nature. All the wind and rain could not be concealed, and only by relying on one's own hard work could one withstand it. This difference caused the living beings in the inner and outer regions, or at least, the difference between the living beings in Matian's sanctuary and southern wilderness. Although there were occasional fights in Matian's sanctuary, all the fights were controlled. However, all the battles were restrained, and they were restricted to a relatively safe area by an unimaginably powerful figure. In this way, the Matian sanctuary became much more peaceful and stable, but it also allowed the cultivators there to experience less life and death. If one's will lacked training, cultivation, and strength, naturally, they would not be able to display their full potential. Under such circumstances, it could be said that a rank 2 immortal near Longchuan City was likely to be defeated by a rank 1 immortal from the southern barbarians of the outer domain in their first encounter. Obviously, this kind of thing should have happened many times in the past. Otherwise, the surrounding people would not have shown such a look of disbelief when they saw Ba Yuan's aura clashing with the young man's. All these thoughts flashed through Luo Fan's mind. At this moment, only a moment had passed since Ba Yuan and the young man's aura clashed. Is this southern wilderness? I don't think we need to register anywhere. Luo Fan smiled and said nonchalantly. The surrounding people were slightly stunned by Luo Fan's indifferent attitude, especially the young man who clashed with Ba Yuan's aura. He was so surprised that he didn't know how to react. He didn't do well in the southern wilderness. Although he could barely keep up with the crowd, he was still far from being able to stand out. A few days ago, he encountered a rather depressing matter that he couldn't get rid of, so he came here to wait. He was waiting to see if there would be a rookie from the inner region appearing so he could bully them and vent his anger. This could also be said to let them know what kind of world the Outland was. He was also lucky. Originally, this void gate didn't open even once in a few months or years. This time, he only waited for a few days and someone came through the void gate. Therefore, he opened his mouth to provoke them. He planned to wait for Luo Fan and Ba Yuan to fight him when they couldn't stand the provocation. Then he could teach them a lesson and vent his anger. As for whether or not he could defeat Luo Fan and Ba Yuan, he didn't doubt it at all. Although he didn't do well in the outer region. But after all, he was in the outer region. He was born with a sense of superiority towards the cultivators who lived in the inner region. This sense of superiority made him have absolute confidence in winning even if he met an inner region cultivator who was one rank higher than him. But at this moment, only Ba Yuan's counterattack at the beginning was within his expectations. Everything that happened afterwards was beyond his expectations. First of all, the second stage immortal, who looked like he only had cultivation but didn't know how to fight, easily blocked his killing intent, and didn't even look embarrassed. This was very different from the immortals of the inner regions in his impression. Secondly, Luo Fan seemed to have a higher status. They seemed to be both weak and strong, but they didn't care about his provocation at all. They acted as if nothing had happened and asked about the procedures. These two unexpected things made him unable to react for a while. But after all, he was also a rank 1 immortal who had experienced countless life and death situations. His control over his mind had reached a quite amazing level. Therefore, he quickly calmed down and said, "Do you think this is still the inner region? This is Nanman, a world where the weak are prey to the strong. No one will be responsible for your death. No one will care what you do as long as you can do it. Registration, my ass." As he said that, his heart trembled. He suddenly understood what he was doing and couldn't help but break out in a cold sweat. He didn't say anything else and didn't care about Luo Fan and Ba Yuan. He turned around and quickly left the square. As that person left, the surrounding people who were originally spectating also gradually dispersed. In the end, only a seemingly kind old man came forward with a smile and said, "Is this the first time you two immortals have come to the southern wilderness?" "That's right, what advice do you have for me?" Luo Fan said with a smile. The old man was only at the 9th rank of the mortal realm. He was considered a big shot in Dragon River City. At the very least, he could protect himself. But in the south, from what Luo Fan had seen before, it was still not enough to protect himself with this kind of strength. At this moment, he came to talk. For some reason, Luo Fan was rather interested. The old man chuckled. He said, "I'm afraid the two immortals already know the difference between the southern wilderness and the inner region, so I won't say more. This old man has some artifacts here that might be of help to the two immortals in traveling the southern wilderness. I wonder if the two immortals are interested?" Hearing this, how could Luo Fan not understand the old man's purpose? He suddenly said, "It just so happens that I'm quite unfamiliar with the southern wilderness. If I can have some artifacts to increase my understanding of the southern wilderness, it's quite good." The old man was overjoyed and said, "In that case, please come to my shop. Sir, please lead the way." Luo Fan smiled and made a gesture of invitation. The old man bowed, turned around, and left the square with Luo Fan and Ba Yuan. During this process, the pedestrians who occasionally passed by the square looked at the old man enviously, as if the old man was about to obtain great benefits. But for some reason, the pedestrians were thousands of times stronger than the old man, but none of them came to stop the old man and snatch the benefits that the old man was about to obtain. There seemed to be some kind of rule. When they followed the old man to his shop, Luo Fan observed the various landscapes of the city. The old man was also very tactful. Along the way, he kept talking about the history of the southern barbarian to Luo Fan and Ba Yuan. He introduced the various characteristics of this place, and also talked about some of the unknown and famous rules. This introduction made Luo Fan have a much deeper understanding of the southern wilderness. At the same time, he understood what the young man said before. He understood that the southern wilderness, or the entire outer region, was indeed a place where the strong preyed on the weak. As long as you were strong enough, you could do anything you wanted, and as long as you weren't strong enough, you could almost lose the things you treasured at any time. Although this old man was only at the 9th rank of the mortal realm, the shop he worked for wasn't the small shop he spoke of. From his tone, Luo Fan could roughly guess that the owner of the shop this old man worked for was definitely an existence with great strength. If it wasn't for that, this old man wouldn't be living so leisurely. Traces of repair could be seen everywhere in the city. Some places looked extremely new, as if they had just been repaired not long ago. Only a very small part of the city showed traces of time. Suddenly Ba Yuan, who had not spoken for a long time, suddenly asked, "Since life here is so difficult, why don't you go back to the inner region?" Luo Fan did not care much about this kind of behavior that did not have the consciousness of a servant. He smiled slightly, waiting for the old man's answer. When the old man heard this, he looked at Ba Yuan with an extremely subtle expression. It was as if he suddenly realized something, but it was also as if he was looking at an extremely ignorant person. After a long time, he sighed and said, "It seems that you must have been deceived by someone. Otherwise, you wouldn't have entered the outer region without knowing this." As he spoke, he looked at Luo Fan and Ba Yuan with a pitiful gaze. No matter what, Ba Yuan was still a second-rank immortal. When he heard the old man's words, he knew that the situation was bad. He had a rough idea of what was going on. As expected, the old man's next words confirmed his suspicions. The inner region and outer region are almost two completely different worlds. Our outer region is a wild land in the eyes of the inner region. Anyone from the inner region who wants to leave the outer region from the inner region can do so as long as they can afford the price to open the void gate. They don't even need to go through any procedures. All they need to do is say the word. However, it's completely different if they want to go back after coming out. The old man sighed at this point, as if he had recalled something he did not want to recall. He paused for a long time before continuing. Whether or not creatures from the outer region leave the inner region, if they want to go back, they need to go through dozens of procedures and apply for it for hundreds or even thousands of years. They also need to go through layers upon layers of tests. In the end, it all depends on whether a city in the inner region is willing to accept them. After going through all these procedures, out of 10,000 creatures who want to enter the inner region, less than 10 have a chance of successfully entering. Even immortals don't have much of a chance. In fact, for ordinary immortals, the chances are even smaller due to their strength. I've never experienced such difficulty, so I can't imagine it at all. As he spoke, the old man's expression became both sorrowful and angry. He also became much quieter. With this kind of performance, it was obvious that he had suffered some losses because of this rule. In fact, many tragic things had happened because of these rules. Otherwise, he would not have acted like this. Luo Fan had already expected this, so he listened to the old man's explanation. He didn't pay too much attention to the old man's explanation, but Ba Yuan felt as if he had been struck by lightning. He felt as if his entire world had been turned upside down. "So you're saying that I can't go back?" At this moment, this was the only thought in his mind. He was born and grew up on that mountain for tens of millions of years. He had long become an inseparable entity with it. It was a bond that was even deeper than home. Under these circumstances, suddenly hearing someone say that he might never be able to see that mountain again and enjoy the leisurely life there again. Even if he was no longer a slave for 3,000 years, he still wouldn't be able to truly return to that place. It was easy to imagine how much of an impact that kind of feeling was on him. For a moment, he suddenly felt a kind of resentment. It was a kind of resentment towards Luo Fan, the culprit who had brought him to such a difficult situation. The appearance of this resentment was not out of Luo Fan's expectations, but it still made Luo Fan frown slightly. However, he still had to be a slave for 3,000 years. If he always harbored resentment, how could he do things wholeheartedly in the future? Thus, Luo Fan interrupted and asked, "Sir, is there a way to directly bypass all the rules and return to the inner region?" "There is such a way, but it's far too difficult. It's practically impossible for ordinary people." The old man still had a strong sense of professionalism after all. When he heard Luo Fan's question, he collected his thoughts and replied. When Ba Yuan heard that, he even put aside his resentment towards Luo Fan. He looked at the old man with a rather expectant gaze and said, "As long as it's possible, there's hope. Sir, please tell me." The old man felt a lot of pressure from being stared at, but after all, he was very knowledgeable, so his expression didn't change much. He said, "Actually, there are two types. The first is when a rank 9 celestial can directly open the void gate and enter the inner region with just a word. The second is to find a rank 9 immortal and become their disciple. When the rank 9 immortal enters the inner region, they can follow him in. However, rank 9 immortals are only one step away from the saint realm. How can a rank 9 immortal who truly aspires to become a saint be willing to return to the inner region? It's very difficult to enter the inner region with these two methods. It's more difficult than going through the application process. When Ba Yuan heard the old man's words, he also felt despair at first. But very soon, he suddenly glanced at Luo Fan. When he saw that his master of 3,000 years, Luo Fan's expression did not change at all, as if he had not heard anything at all. He looked confident, or like everything the old man said did not affect him at all. Could it be that my master is actually a rank 9 immortal, and can return to the inner region at any time? If that's not the case, how can he be so calm? When this thought flashed through his mind, he suddenly felt a surge of hope. This hope was not very strong. Usually, he might even ignore it as a vague fantasy. But at this moment, when he was close to despair, he instantly grasped this hope. It must be so. I only knew that he was an immortal 3 ranks stronger than me, but I didn't know what rank he was. Seeing how calm he is, he must be a rank 9 immortal. It must be so. When he thought of this, the resentment in his heart instantly disappeared without a trace. It was replaced by a desire to follow Luo Fan closely. He wanted to follow Luo Fan for a long time and wait for a chance to return to the inner region with him. Luo Fan watched Ba Yuan's thoughts change and could not help but sigh. With such a mind, even if he has an excellent cultivation environment, it will be difficult for him to achieve anything in the future. It's a pity that he has such an excellent physical talent. Luo Fan sighed. To be continued. Chapter 762. Although Luo Fan had never seen Ba Yuan's original form, judging from his appearance when he first saw Ba Yuan, his original form should be similar to that of a mutated ape. TXT ebook download ***. This form was somewhat similar to the natural Taoism aptitude of the great Tianyuan world, which meant that his cultivation aptitude was not too far off from the natural Taoism aptitude of other creatures. In addition, from what Luo Fan could see, Ba Yuan's original form had a talent that the natural Taoism aptitude did not have. This talent was hidden in the deepest parts of his body, and for tens of millions of years, Ba Yuan had only developed a small part of its power, which made it easier for him to control the way of fire. But that was all. He had not activated the deeper power of this talent at all. Luo Fan had previously changed his mind about ignoring Ba Yuan and wanted him to be a slave for 3,000 years precisely because he had taken a fancy to this talent of his and thought that it might be of help to him in the future. But unfortunately, with Ba Yuan's intelligence, it was almost impossible for him to grow to the point where he could be of help to Yi Futian. As a creature with intelligence, it was naturally understandable that he wanted to return to his home, to the place where he was born and raised. It was even worthy of recognition, even if he had to make some sacrifices for it. Yi Futian could naturally understand that Ba Yuan had put down his resentment and decided to follow Yi Futian wholeheartedly in order to return to his home, but that did not mean that Yi Futian thought highly of Ba Yuan's thoughts. After all, there should be a certain level of sacrifice. If Ba Yuan was willing to be a slave for a long time just to return home, how would he have the heart to pursue the way, and how would he have the heart to cultivate? Moreover, nearly 10 out of 10,000 people who applied to return to the inner area would be successful. Although this probability of 1 in 1,000 was extremely small, it was not completely hopeless. If he did not even have the confidence that he was 1 in 1,000, how could he even talk about transcending and standing above all living beings? It was precisely because of this that Luo Fan felt disappointed. However, Ba Yuan was only his slave after all. Furthermore, he had only been a slave for 3,000 years. He wasn't even his disciple. Luo Fan would not give him advice on this. Therefore, this thought only flashed through his mind for a moment before he cast it aside. As he spoke, the old man led Luo Fan and Ba Yuan to the front of a shop. This shop was quite large, and it was actually not very far from the plaza. It was only 2 or 3 streets away. A large plaque hung high in front of the shop, on which the words "Myriad Tools Pavilion" were written in large characters. The entire shop was located by the roadside, and it was extremely eye-catching. There was a faint pressure that seemed to be able to shatter the heavens and earth with a single tremor. It was brewing and restraining itself. Compared to the other buildings around it, the Myriad Weapon Pavilion seemed more ancient, as if it had existed for a longer time. Even the most recent locations had existed for at least tens of thousands of years, and the oldest had a history of nearly 1,000,000 years. Although this was far from the various things in Longchuan City, compared to the various things that Luo Fan had seen in Nanman, this Wanqi Pavilion was the least damaged. With such a result, it was obvious that the strength of this Wanqi Pavilion was the strongest existence that Luo Fan had seen along the way in the southern wilderness. Otherwise, it would be impossible to achieve this. As soon as they entered the Wanqi Pavilion, they saw a huge room with several rows of shelves. On the shelves there were all kinds of strange objects. Some of these objects exuded a powerful aura that oppressed everything around them. Some were like a black hole that attracted all the aura from the outside world, and some were lying on the shelves like ordinary objects. There were several people in this room at this time. 2 of them were guests like Luo Fan and Ba Yuan, and the rest were the staff of the Wanqi Pavilion. They were either maintaining the objects or introducing something to the guests. When the old man came in, the others took a look at him and greeted him with a smile. They said a word of welcome to Luo Fan, then ignored them and continued to do their own things. After the old man responded to everyone with a smile, he said to Luo Fan, "Immortal, please come this way." Luo Fan smiled and nodded, but did not speak. The old man led Luo Fan to a shelf next to the entrance. The objects on this shelf all had restrained aura and seemed to exist like ordinary objects. Obviously, this Wanqi Pavilion was not a place to buy and sell ordinary things. Therefore, the items on the shelves must have the requirement to restrain their auras or be more powerful than the other items in the room. All kinds of objects on this shelf are objects that can be used when you first set foot in the southern wilderness. Immortal, you can take a look and will definitely find what you need. The old man laughed and said. Luo Fan nodded and picked up the artifact closest to him. This was a roll of leather made of unknown materials. It was tough and soft, like touching the skin of a woman. It felt very comfortable. As soon as he touched this roll of leather, Luo Fan's eyes lit up. This leather roll was not an ordinary object, but a magic tool that was refined into the shape of a leather roll. The cultivation civilization of the great Tianyuan world had developed for trillions of years. Because of the existence of sages, there were not too many gaps. Today, it had already flourished to an unimaginable level. There were also countless ways to refine magic tools. It could almost be said that all the methods of refining magic tools that Luo Fan could imagine existed in the great Tianyuan world. It was the unique method of using layers of restrictions to build magic tools in the untainted land. The great Tianyuan world also had a similar method, but because the world was different, the rules were different, the laws were different, and the great Tao were different. This kind of similar method was not orthodox or mainstream. At this time, this leather roll-like magic tool was refined using this method that was similar to the construction of layers of restrictions. Luo Fan stretched out his hand, and the structure and details of the magic tool were completely grasped by him in an instant, like the lines on his palm. He could not help but secretly exclaim in admiration at this grasp. Although the method of using layers of restrictions to build magic tools was not orthodox or mainstream in the great Tianyuan world, after all, it had been developed over a long period of time, so it was extremely perfect. The various construction methods and the arrangement of restrictions even had many mysteries that Luo Fan could not imagine, and it gave him many hints on the path of refining magic tools. Just this harvest alone was enough to make Luo Fan feel that even if this was the only harvest and nothing else, it would still be completely worth it. With a thought, he focused his attention on the magic tool in his hand. This magic tool only had 10 layers of restrictions, and its power was only ordinary. Luo Fan could casually refine 8 to 10 of them. However, it was not used to fight enemies. Instead, it was like a notebook used to record information. When he unrolled the leather scroll, he saw that there were countless spots of light on it. These spots of light were densely packed, as if there were countless stars in the starry sky, and they were distributed everywhere on the leather scroll. With a thought from Luo Fan, a wave of power rushed into the leather scroll from his hand. In an instant, he found that the leather scroll trembled and light shone on it. In an instant, it formed a strange pattern on the leather scroll. The pattern was extremely realistic, as if something that existed in reality had been directly transferred onto the map. It was a map of a city and its surrounding area that was 10 times the size of the city. The surface was extremely detailed. With a thought from Luo Fan, a certain location would be zoomed in at an extremely fast speed, and even the details of a table and a chair would be shown clearly. However, the light and shadow displayed on the surface was clearly not real-time, but a scene from a certain period of time in the past. At the very least, at this moment, there was no sign of Luo Fan in the vicinity of the shop, and even the other buildings were slightly different. So that's how it is. It really is mysterious. Luo Fan could not help but exclaim in admiration, and he put the leather scroll away. As for the map on the leather scroll not being displayed in real time, he had already expected it. After all, this was just a map. If the area marked on the map was displayed in real time, then it would not be a map, but something similar to a monitor. That way, not only would other cultivators not agree, but even if the powerful person behind the shop had the strength to suppress all dissatisfaction and really make this thing, the value of this thing would definitely be tens of thousands of times more than the current map. How could it be placed on the shelf like this? After putting down the map, Luo Fan turned to the old man and asked, "This map is not bad, but the area is too small. How big is the largest map that can be found in the Myriad Tool Pavilion?" The old man's eyes lit up when he heard this, and he said with joy, "Our pavilion has branches in all the major cities of the Wasteland continent. Together, we can roughly mark the topography of the entire Wasteland continent, and apart from some sensitive places, we can roughly mark all of them. It's just that the price is a little expensive, and it is not here. If a mortal wants it, you can wait in the VIP room." The Wasteland continent was the name of the continent where the southern barbarians were located. The Wasteland continent and the surrounding thousands of continents were called the Barbarian Domain. This was also the method of dividing the saint domains in the inner domain. After all, the 800 saints occupied the top of the great Tianyuan world, so other cultivators naturally unconsciously drew close to them. As for why only a few thousand continents were combined into one domain, and not 10,000 continents were combined into one domain like the inner domain, it was because there were no saints to integrate these continents into an inseparable whole. There were many continents at the edge of the domain that had different opinions about where they belonged. Therefore, there were only a few thousand continents, but not 10,000 continents were a domain. Luo Fan had already learned about this information from the old man's narration. The Myriad Tool Pavilion could roughly mark the terrain of a continent. This was already 1 in 1,000 of the Barbarian Domain, but it was beyond his expectations. It was simply a pleasant surprise. "How long will it take to get the map?" Luo Fan asked. The old man calculated for a moment and said, "The map is quite precious. With my position, it will take at least a few minutes to get it." "Oh, in that case, I'll take a look here. You go get it and I'll go to the VIP room." Luo Fan smiled and said, "That's fine too. Immortal, please do as you please." The old man naturally wouldn't say anything, so he nodded and said. After that, He called out to a young man next to him and asked the young man to come and greet Luo Fan. Then, he hurriedly went into a man's room in the depths of this room. The young man glanced at the old man enviously. Obviously, if the old man asked Luo Fan to buy the map, he would definitely make a lot of money. The young man's style was completely different from the old man's. As soon as he greeted Luo Fan, he began to introduce the various items on the shelf. There were all kinds of strange objects. Some were temporary dwellings for living in the wild, some were communication tools for flying in the sky and burrowing into the earth, some were identification tools for identifying all kinds of living beings, some were storage tools for collecting materials, some were residences for spirit beasts, fierce beasts, and strange beasts, and some were tools for healing injuries and saving lives. There were so many of them that they covered almost every possible situation that could be encountered in the barbarian region. If it was a mortal, they would definitely feel dizzy from hearing so many items, and they would even feel a sense of wariness because the barbarian domain was so complicated and dangerous. But for a powerful immortal like Luo Fan, these would only make him smile. He felt that it would be much more convenient to travel in the barbarian domain with these items. Therefore, during the time the old man went to get the map, Luo Fan bought dozens of items, and they were all the best of the same kind in the myriad tool pavilion. The young man couldn't help but grin. Even if his gains couldn't compare to the old man's, it wouldn't be much less. It would be more than a month or two of his work's earnings, but it wouldn't be much of a problem. He used an immortal technique to trade these items. With the energy of 8 yuan, it was not difficult to condense a rank 2 immortal technique to trade these items. With a bit of time, he would naturally condense these items and turn them into Luo Fans. This was probably the only use of the 8 yuan at this time. After all, Luo Fan did not need him to do anything at this time. The only thing he could help Luo Fan was to condense a technique for him when Luo Fan needed it. At this time, Ba Yuan's attitude had already changed. He appeared to be much more attentive than before, and his expression was also much more respectful than before. Without waiting for Luo Fan's signal, he immediately began to negotiate with the youth, and very quickly completed the transaction. By the time the trade was completed, the old man had already returned. But at this time, his hands were empty, and he did not hold the map. Immortal has waited for a long time. Please come to the VIP room, the map has been obtained, the old man said respectfully. Luo Fan nodded and said, please lead the way. The old man nodded and turned around, leading Luo Fan and Ba Yuan through a few rows of shelves. When they arrived at the end of the room, they discovered that there was not only the small men that the old man had entered and exited from. Beside the small men, there were also several large men that were much larger than the small men. It was just that these large men were previously blocked by the shelves, so they could not be seen near the entrance of the room. There were many defenses on the shelves in this room. The threads of energy were faintly discernible, and formed a grand array that enveloped all the items in the room. It defended against all energy attacks and movements that exceeded the limits of the array. It was indescribably exquisite and incomparably mysterious. But compared to the defenses on the large men, these defenses were practically non-existent. The large men looked like ordinary wood to the eyes of ordinary people, but if one used a spiritual eye to look at them, they would discover that the large men were densely engraved with countless tiny runes. Every rune had thousands of twists and turns, like spirit snakes and dragons. They gradually formed a mysterious pattern on the large men, forming a pattern that was in accordance with some sort of law, or even supreme great Tao. The power was contained within, but just by sensing it, one could tell that if this power were to explode, even a third-stage immortal would be instantly turned to dust. Such a VIP room was indeed able to give the guests an extraordinary sense of security. Luo Fan glanced at the old man, only to see that the old man had a respectful expression on his face as he pushed open the door of the VIP room and said, "Immortal, please enter." Luo Fan smiled and entered the VIP room with Ba Yuan. This VIP room was not just a small room, but a rather large space. It was obvious that a technique that could open up space had been used on it. This space had a circumference of several hundred meters, and the surroundings had been arranged using an illusion technique to create the scenery of a mountainous area. In the middle of the room, there was an extremely comfortable row of soft chairs and a table. Luo Fan walked forward and sat on the soft chair. An incomparably comfortable and relaxed feeling instantly filled his mind, making him want to never get up again. On the table in front of the soft chair, there was already a leather scroll. At first glance, this leather scroll looked similar to the one that Luo Fan had seen before. There was still nothing special about it. But when Luo Fan saw this leather scroll, he knew that it was vastly different from the previous scroll. Perhaps they had used the same sacrificial refining method to refine the magic tool, but the number of restrictions on this magic tool must be much more than the previous scroll. The reason why he had such a feeling was because this leather scroll was more obscure and ordinary than the previous one. There was nothing unusual about it. The previous leather scroll could still be seen to be made of a different material, but this one seemed to be made of the most common leather. There seemed to be nothing mysterious about the leather, as if it was only made of a slightly better material than the clothes worn by mortals. For Luo Fan, who had amazing eyesight, to have such a wonderful feeling, this magic tool was definitely not an ordinary magic tool. The old man had no intention of keeping Ba Yuan in suspense. When he saw Ba Yuan standing behind Luo Fan and Luo Fan not saying anything, he had truly confirmed the relationship between Ba Yuan and Luo Fan. Therefore, he did not take the unnecessary step of asking Ba Yuan to sit down. Instead, he walked up to the table, picked up the leather scroll with both hands, and presented it to Luo Fan. He said, "This scroll is a map of the Wasteland continent. Great Immortal, please take a look and see if it is to your liking."